700,000 scrolls. The complete works of every Greek playwright. Medical treatises that wouldn't be rediscovered for 1,000 years. The original calculations that proved the Earth goes around the Sun. All of it lost. The Library of Alexandria was the greatest collection of human knowledge ever assembled. And tonight, we're going to walk its marble halls together, meet the scholars who filled its shelves, and discover how it all quietly slipped away. Close your eyes, rest, and let the ancient world wash over you. There was once a place where all human knowledge lived under one roof. Every poem ever written, every theorem ever proved, every map ever drawn of lands both real and imagined. In a white marble building by the shores of the Mediterranean, scholars from every corner of the ancient world gathered to read, to think, to dream. This was the Library of Alexandria. Tonight, we shall walk its halls together. We shall meet the curious minds who filled its shelves, and we shall witness how the greatest collection of knowledge ever assembled slowly, quietly, slipped away from human memory. There is no need to remember any of this. No test tomorrow. No notes to take. Simply rest and let the ancient world wash over you, like waves upon the Alexandrian shore. Let us begin in the year 331 before the Common Era, when a young Macedonian king stood on the edge of Egypt and dreamed of building a city unlike any the world had ever seen. The Mediterranean stretched out in the winter light, grey-blue and endless, as Alexander of Macedon gazed across the Egyptian coast. He was 24 years old. He had already conquered more of the world than any Greek before him, and now, standing on a narrow strip of land between the sea and a great lake called Mereotis, he saw something that no one else could see. He saw a city. To understand what Alexander saw, we must first understand what was actually there. And what was there, in truth, was very little. The place Alexander stood was called Rakotis by the Egyptians, a simple fishing village, home to a few hundred souls who mended their nets and pulled their catches from the warm, shallow waters. It was, by any reasonable measure, an unremarkable place. The houses were small and low. The harbour was adequate but hardly grand. The surrounding land was flat and dusty, broken only by a few date palms bending in the coastal wind. And yet Alexander saw what it could become. Perhaps it was the natural harbour, sheltered from the open sea by a long island called Pharos that lay a mile offshore. Perhaps it was the position, ideally placed for trade routes connecting Greece to Egypt, to Persia, to lands even farther east. Perhaps it was simply the way the light fell on the water that particular morning, casting the whole scene in silver and gold. Whatever the reason, Alexander made his decision. Here, on this unassuming stretch of Egyptian coast, he would build the greatest city the world had ever known. It is worth pausing here to consider the man himself. This Alexander who stood on the Egyptian shore with dreams of glory in his eyes. He was not tall, by most accounts. He was rather short, even by the standards of the ancient Greeks. His hair was golden, worn long in the Macedonian fashion. His eyes were different colours, one grey and one brown, which gave his gaze an unsettling intensity. He had been trained from childhood for greatness. His father, Philip II of Macedon, had transformed a backwater kingdom into the dominant power of the Greek world. His mother, Olympias, was a princess of Papyrus, a woman of fierce intelligence and fierce ambition. Together, they had raised a son who believed from his earliest years that he was destined to change the world. At 16, Alexander had served as regent of Macedon while his father was away at war. At 18, he had commanded the cavalry at the Battle of Chaeronea, crushing the sacred band of Thebes, the most feared fighting force in Greece. At 20, When his father was assassinated, Alexander had seized the throne and immediately set about proving that he was no mere inheritor of power. Within 2 years, he had crossed into Asia with an army of 40,000 men. He had defeated the Persians at the river Chronicus, then again at Issus. He had taken Tyre after a siege of 7 months. He had conquered the entire eastern coast of the Mediterranean before finally turning south, toward Egypt, toward the land of pyramids and pharaohs. And now here he was, still not 25 years old, planning a city that would bear his name for millennia. The young king had arrived in Egypt just weeks earlier, in the autumn of 331. His conquest had been swift and, remarkably, almost bloodless. The Egyptians had little love for their Persian overlords, who had ruled them for nearly 2 centuries, with varying degrees of harshness. When Alexander's army appeared at the borders, the Persian satrap simply surrendered. Egypt fell without a battle. The Egyptians welcomed their new ruler as a liberator. They called him Pharaoh. They treated him as a god. Before coming to Rakotis, Alexander had done something remarkable. He had journeyed deep into the western desert, across 300 miles of trackless sand, to visit the oracle of Zeus Ammon at the Siwa oasis. The journey was perilous. 2 centuries earlier, the Persian king Cambyses had sent an army of 50,000 men across these same sands to destroy the oracle. That army had vanished without a trace, swallowed by a sandstorm, and to this day their bones lie somewhere beneath the dunes, unmarked and unremembered. Alexander went anyway. The desert crossing took 8 days. Alexander's party traveled light, just a few hundred soldiers and guides, carrying water in skins and navigating by the stars. The days were hot, the nights were cold, and the sand stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by the occasional rocky outcrop or withered acacia tree. According to the ancient sources, the travelers lost their way at one point. The landmarks vanished. The guides became confused. For a time, it seemed that Alexander might share the fate of Cambyses' lost army. And then, the stories say, a miracle occurred. 2 crows appeared out of the empty sky and began to fly ahead of the party, leading them onward. Or perhaps it was 2 serpents. The accounts differ. What matters is that Alexander chose to see divine guidance in the appearance of these creatures. He followed them, and they led him true. Siwa, when they finally reached it, must have seemed like a dream after the emptiness of the desert. The oasis was lush and green, fed by underground springs that had flowed since time immemorial. Date palms swayed in the breeze. Gardens grew thick with pomegranates and figs, and at the heart of the oasis stood the temple of Zeus Ammon, its white walls gleaming against the blue sky. Alexander had come to ask the oracle a question, though what that question was, he never told anyone. Some say he asked about his father's murder, wanting to know if the guilty had been punished. Some say he asked about his own destiny, seeking confirmation of what he already believed. Some say he asked nothing at all, merely stood before the god and waited to receive whatever wisdom might come. What we know is only what the oracle told him. The priests at Siwa greeted Alexander with ancient ceremonies. They led him into the inner sanctum of the temple, a cool dark chamber where the god Ammon, whom the Greeks called Zeus, was said to speak through the mouths of his servants. And there, in the flickering light of oil lamps, the high priest addressed Alexander with words that would echo through history. He called Alexander the son of Zeus. Whether Alexander believed this, we cannot say. He was a practical man in many ways, a student of Aristotle, trained in logic and observation. But he was also a man of his time, raised on stories of heroes who were half divine, whose blood mingled the mortal and the immortal. His mother, Olympias, had always hinted that his true father was not Philip of Macedon, but a god who had visited her in the form of a serpent. Perhaps Alexander simply accepted what he had always suspected, or perhaps he understood the political value of such a claim. A king who is favored by the gods is a king whom none can safely oppose. Whatever his private thoughts, Alexander left Siwa with a new certainty. He was destined for something extraordinary, and the city he would build on the Egyptian coast would be the proof. The architect Alexander chose for his new city was a man named Dinocrates. Like Alexander, he was young and ambitious. Like Alexander, he thought on a grand scale. The legend says that Dinocrates first came to Alexander's attention through an outrageous stunt. Unable to gain an audience through normal channels, Dinocrates stripped naked, oiled his body like an athlete, wrapped himself in a lion skin, and strode into the king's presence as if he were Hercules himself. When the guards moved to stop him, Alexander was so amused that he waved them aside. "What do you want?" he asked. Dinocrates wanted to carve Mount Athos into a statue of Alexander, a seated figure so vast that it would hold an entire city in one hand and pour a river from the other. Alexander smiled at the audacity of the proposal. He could appreciate such grand thinking, even when it crossed into the absurd. But the king was also practical. Where would the city's people grow their food? He asked. How would they find fresh water high on a mountainside? The project, for all its magnificence, would be a monument to nothing. The people who lived there would starve. But Alexander remembered Dinocrates. He remembered the boldness, the willingness to think beyond all ordinary bounds. When he stood on the Egyptian coast and imagined a city where none existed, he knew who he wanted to build it. Dinocrates arrived in Rhodes and began his work. Day after day, he walked the narrow peninsula between the sea and the lake, measuring distances, studying the winds, observing the movement of the sun across the sky. He had his surveyors take soundings in the harbour. He had his engineers examine the underground water sources, the ancient cisterns that the Egyptians had carved beneath the village. And then, when he had gathered all the information he needed, Dinocrates sat down and designed a city. The city that Dinocrates planned was unlike anything the ancient world had seen before. It would be built on a grid pattern, streets running straight and true, crossing at perfect right angles. This was not the haphazard growth of older cities, where lanes wandered where they would and buildings clustered in organic confusion. This was a city designed from the beginning, every block measured, every avenue planned. The main street, which the Greeks called the Canopic Way, would run east to west through the heart of the city, 100 feet wide, lined with marble columns. A second great avenue would cross it from north to south, connecting the harbour to the lake. Where these two streets met, there would be a public square, a gathering place for citizens, a heart for the city's civic life. Along the waterfront, Dinocrates planned great harbour works, quays and wharves, warehouses and shipyards. A causeway would connect the mainland to the island of Pharos, creating two protected harbours, one facing east and one facing west. Ships from anywhere in the Mediterranean could find shelter here, could load and unload their cargoes, could rest before continuing their journeys to distant shores. And rising above it all, Dinocrates envisioned monuments. Temples to the gods, both Greek and Egyptian, a palace for the king, public buildings where scholars might gather and debate, gardens where philosophers could walk and think. The story goes that when it came time to mark out the boundaries of the new city, Alexander himself took part. He walked the perimeter, indicating where the walls should stand, where the gates should open. But the surveyors had forgotten to bring chalk, so they marked the lines with flour instead, white lines traced on the dark earth, showing the shape of what was to come. As they worked, birds descended from the sky, flocks of them, drawn by the scattered grain, pecking at the flower lines, erasing the boundaries almost as quickly as they were drawn. Alexander was disturbed by this omen. He called for his seers, his interpreters of signs. The seers considered the matter. Then they smiled. "This is a good omen," they told the king. "The birds come to feed because your city will provide sustenance for many peoples. Alexandria will nourish the world." Alexander was pleased. He ordered the work to continue, but Alexander himself would never see his city completed. In truth, he would barely see it begun. He was, above all else, a conqueror. He had come to Egypt as part of his war against the Persian Empire, and that war was far from over. The Persian king, Darius, still commanded vast armies to the east. There were battles yet to be fought, kingdoms yet to be won. In the spring of 331, just months after founding Alexandria, Alexander left Egypt forever. He marched his army east, toward Mesopotamia, toward the heartland of the Persian Empire. He would never return. The city he left behind was little more than a construction site, a grid of marked streets, the foundations of a few buildings, the beginnings of a harbor wall. Dinocrates stayed behind to oversee the work, but Alexander pressed on toward his destiny. The years that followed were the stuff of legend. Alexander defeated Darius at Gaugamela in one of history's most decisive battles. He took Babylon, that ancient wonder. He captured Persepolis and burned the palace of the Persian kings. He pushed his conquests to the very edge of the known world, through the mountains of Afghanistan, across the rivers of the Punjab, until at last his exhausted soldiers refused to go any further. Only then did Alexander turn back. Only then, having conquered an empire that stretched from Greece to India, did he begin the long journey home. But home, for Alexander, was no longer Macedon. His capital now was Babylon, that gleaming city on the Euphrates. And it was in Babylon, in the summer of 323 before the Common Era, that Alexander fell ill. The illness came on suddenly. A fever, at first, then weakness that spread through his limbs, that stole his voice, that left the most powerful man in the world unable to lift his head from his pillow. For 11 days, Alexander lingered. His generals gathered around his bed, asking desperately who would inherit his empire. To whom would he leave this vast realm that he had built through blood and genius? Alexander's answer, if he gave one, was unclear. Some say he whispered, "To the strongest." Others say he could no longer speak at all. He was 32 years old. On a June afternoon, with the sun blazing over Babylon, Alexander the Great closed his eyes and died. What followed was chaos. An empire with no clear heir is an empire destined for civil war, and Alexander's generals wasted no time in staking their claims. They were ambitious men, hardened by decades of warfare, and each believed himself worthy of some portion of Alexander's legacy. The empire was carved apart. Greece went to one general, Anatolia to another. Syria, Persia, and the lands farther east were divided and contested. Alliances formed and shattered. Former brothers in arms became mortal enemies. And Egypt, wealthy Egypt, fell to a general named Ptolemy. Ptolemy, son of Lagos, was one of Alexander's oldest companions. They had grown up together in the Macedonian court, had studied together under Aristotle, had fought side by side through a dozen campaigns. Ptolemy knew Alexander better than almost anyone. He understood how Alexander thought, how Alexander inspired, how Alexander won. And Ptolemy was clever in a way that many of the other generals were not. While they fought over the glamorous provinces, the traditional seats of power, Ptolemy quietly secured Egypt, rich, defensible Egypt, separated from the squabbling factions by deserts and seas. But Ptolemy did more than claim a kingdom. He also claimed a body. When Alexander died in Babylon, his generals agreed that his body should return to Macedon, to be buried in the royal tombs of his ancestors. A magnificent funeral cart was constructed, a wheeled temple, its roof supported by golden columns, its walls decorated with paintings of Alexander's victories. Inside, within a golden sarcophagus, lay the preserved body of the king himself, still wearing his armor. The funeral procession set out westward, accompanied by an army of soldiers and attendants. It was the grandest funeral cortege the world had ever seen, a moving monument to a man who had been almost a god. But the procession never reached Macedon. As the cart passed through Syria, Ptolemy intercepted it. With a combination of diplomacy and force, he diverted the funeral procession south, toward Egypt. Alexander had wished to be buried at Siwa, Ptolemy claimed, at the temple of his divine father. It was Ptolemy's duty, as a loyal friend, to see that wish fulfilled. Whether this was true, no one can say. What is certain is that Alexander's body ended up not at Siwa, but in Egypt's new capital, in the city that bore his name. Ptolemy brought Alexander to Alexandria. There, in a tomb of gold and crystal, the body of the conqueror was laid to rest. Visitors came from across the ancient world to gaze upon the face of Alexander, preserved forever in honey and spices. The tomb became a pilgrimage site, a symbol of divine kingship, a talisman of legitimacy. And Ptolemy, the guardian of Alexander's body, became Ptolemy, the ruler of Egypt. He founded a dynasty that would last for 3 centuries, the Ptolemaic dynasty, a line of Greek kings and queens who would rule Egypt until the coming of Rome. Under Ptolemy, Alexandria grew. The construction that Alexander had begun continued and expanded over the following decades. The harbour works were completed first, because Ptolemy understood that trade was the lifeblood of any great city. The causeway to Pharos was built, 7 furlongs of solid stone stretching across the water, creating the 2 harbours that Dinocrates had envisioned. Ships began to arrive from every corner of the Mediterranean, from Athens and Corinth, from Tyre and Sidon, from Rome and Carthage, and the distant lands beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The great avenues were paved with marble. The Canopic Way became one of the wonders of the ancient world, a boulevard so wide that 4 chariots could drive abreast, lined with columns that stretched as far as the eye could see. At night, the street was lit by torches and oil lamps, so that Alexandria glowed like a beacon on the Egyptian coast, visible to sailors miles out at sea. Temples rose along the waterfront, temples to the Greek gods, yes, but also to the Egyptian gods, and to a new deity that Ptolemy himself helped to create. This was Serapis, a fusion of the Greek Zeus and the Egyptian Osiris, a god designed to unite the Greek and Egyptian populations of the city. The great temple of Serapis, called the Serapeum, became one of the most magnificent religious structures in the ancient world, its halls hung with precious tapestries, its altars burning incense day and night. The palace complex spread across the eastern quarter of the city, a sprawling compound of gardens and courtyards, audience halls and private chambers. Here Ptolemy held court, receiving ambassadors from distant kingdoms, dispensing justice, planning the expansion of his domain. The palace grounds covered nearly a quarter of the entire city, with private harbours where the royal boats were moored, with zoos where exotic animals from Africa and Asia were displayed, with gardens where rare plants from every corner of the world were cultivated. Immigrants flooded in from across the Greek world, merchants seeking their fortunes, craftsmen looking for work, soldiers hoping to serve in Ptolemy's army, scholars drawn by the promise of patronage and intellectual freedom. They came from Macedonia and Thrace, from Crete and Cyprus, from the Greek cities of Ionia and the rough hills of Arcadia. They came for opportunity, for adventure, for the chance to be part of something new. The city grew so quickly that Dinocrates' original plan had to be expanded. New neighborhoods were added beyond the initial boundaries. The population swelled from a few thousand to tens of thousands, then to hundreds of thousands. Within a generation, Alexandria had grown from a construction site to one of the largest cities in the Mediterranean, a rival to Athens, to Antioch, even to Rome itself. But Ptolemy wanted more than size. He wanted glory. He wanted his city to be remembered not just as a center of commerce, but as a center of culture, of learning, of civilized achievement. And so, in the evening of his reign, Ptolemy began to dream a new dream. He would collect all the books in the world. He would gather all the wisdom of all the ages. He would build a place where knowledge itself could live, a temple to the Muses, a house of learning, a repository for everything that human beings had ever thought or written or discovered. He would build the library, and it was Ptolemy who would take Alexander's dream of a great city and fill it with something Alexander had never imagined, the collected wisdom of the entire world. Rest now, if you wish. The story will continue. The library is not yet built, and there is much to tell of its creation. But there is no hurry. The ancient world waits patiently, as it has waited for 2,000 years. When next we meet, we shall watch the first scrolls arrive, carried by ship and by caravan, copied by hand, gathered from the far corners of civilization. We shall see how a soldier king became a scholar king, and how a city of marble became a city of words. But for now, the harbour lights of Alexandria are dimming. The ships rest at anchor. The great project is only beginning, and you may rest too. Ptolemy was growing old. He had been a young man when he first rode into battle at Alexander's side, and now his hair was silver and his joints ached in the morning cold. He had spent the better part of his life as a soldier, fighting, conquering, building an empire of his own from the fragments of Alexander's dream. But in his later years, something changed in Ptolemy. The thirst for conquest faded. The appetite for war grew dull, and in its place, a different hunger emerged, a hunger for something that would outlast him, something that would endure long after his bones had turned to dust. Ptolemy had always been curious. Even as a young officer, he had carried books with him on campaign, reading by lamplight while his fellow generals gambled and drank. He had studied under Aristotle alongside Alexander, absorbing the philosopher's lessons on logic, nature, and the proper ordering of knowledge. He understood, perhaps better than any of his contemporaries, that empires are built not just with swords, but with ideas. And so, as he watched his city grow into a marvel of marble and commerce, Ptolemy began to imagine something else, something unprecedented, something that would make Alexandria not just the largest city in the Mediterranean, but the wisest. He would gather every book in the world. To understand what this meant, we must first understand what books were in the ancient world. There were no printing presses, no paper mills, no bookshops with shelves of identical volumes. Every book that existed was a manuscript, copied by hand onto scrolls of papyrus or parchment. Each scroll was unique, shaped by the hand that wrote it, the ink that stained it, the library or private collection where it had been stored for generations. A book, in this era, was precious in a way we can hardly imagine today. To possess a copy of Homer's Iliad or Plato's Republic was to possess something rare, something that might not exist anywhere else in the world. Entire works could be lost if a single scroll was destroyed by fire, flood, or simple neglect. Ptolemy understood this fragility. He understood that knowledge, for all its power, was terribly vulnerable, and he resolved to do something about it. The making of a book in the ancient world was a labor of patience and skill. First, the papyrus had to be prepared. The reed plant grew in the marshes of the Nile Delta, its tall stalks swaying in the Egyptian breeze. Workers would harvest the stalks, strip away the outer rind, and slice the soft inner pith into thin strips. These strips were laid side by side. Then another layer was placed crosswise on top. The two layers were pressed together, pounded, and dried in the sun until they fused into a single sheet, smooth on one side, rough on the other. Sheets were glued together to form long scrolls, sometimes 20 feet in length, sometimes more. The scroll was then polished with a smooth stone or shell until its surface was ready to receive ink. The scribe sat with the scroll across his lap, or spread across a writing table. His ink was made from soot mixed with gum, stored in small pots that he kept within easy reach. His pen was a reed, cut at an angle and split at the tip to hold the ink. Letter by letter, word by word, the scribe copied the text before him. His hand moved steadily across the papyrus, forming the elegant Greek letters that would preserve the thoughts of poets and philosophers for generations to come. A single scroll might take days to complete. A long work like Homer's Iliad might take weeks. And at the end of all this labor, there was still only one copy, one manuscript, in one place, subject to all the accidents that might befall it. To help him realize his vision, Ptolemy turned to a man named Demetrius of Phalerum. Demetrius was a philosopher and a statesman, a student of Aristotle's school in Athens who had once governed that city as its regent. He was brilliant, cultured, and deeply learned, but he had also fallen from power when the political winds shifted in Athens. Now he found himself an exile, seeking a new patron, a new purpose. Ptolemy offered him both. The two men made an unlikely pair, the grizzled soldier king and the refined philosopher, but they shared a conviction that would shape the ancient world. They believed that knowledge was worth preserving. They believed that the accumulated wisdom of all civilizations, Greek and Egyptian, Persian and Babylonian, Hebrew and Phoenician, deserved a home where it could be studied, compared, and passed on to future generations. Together, Ptolemy and Demetrius conceived a plan more ambitious than any library the world had seen. They would not merely collect the books of Greece. They would collect every book ever written, in every language, on every subject. They would create a universal repository of human knowledge, a place where all that humanity had learned could be gathered under a single roof. The first scrolls began arriving in Alexandria around 295 before the Common Era. They came from Athens, naturally, copies of the great tragedies by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, copies of Plato's dialogues and Aristotle's treatises, the histories of Herodotus and Thucydides, the speeches of Demosthenes and Isocrates. For centuries, Athens had been the intellectual capital of the Greek world, and its libraries held treasures beyond counting. Ptolemy sent agents to Athens with gold and instructions. Buy everything, he told them. Copy what cannot be bought. Leave nothing behind. But the book hunters did not stop at Athens. They traveled to Corinth and Thebes, to Ephesus and Miletus, to the islands of the Aegean, and the cities of the Ionian coast. Wherever Greeks had settled, wherever scholars had written and taught, Ptolemy's agents appeared with their purses and their promises. They purchased private libraries from families who had fallen on hard times. They borrowed rare manuscripts from temples and archives, promising to return them, though sometimes the originals stayed in Alexandria, and only copies were sent back. They tracked down obscure texts that survived in only a single copy, in a single provincial town, known only to a handful of local scholars. Scroll by scroll, shipment by shipment, the collection grew. What did these scrolls contain? Everything, or as close to everything as human beings had managed to write down. There were copies of Homer, the Iliad, and the Odyssey, those foundational texts of Greek culture, known by heart by every educated Greek. But there were also variant versions of Homer, copies that differed in small ways from one another, preserving alternative readings that scholars could compare and debate. There were the plays of the great Athenian tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, works that had been performed in the theatres of Athens, and then copied and circulated throughout the Greek world. Some of these plays had already been lost in other cities, destroyed by war or fire or simple neglect. Only in Alexandria were they preserved. There were the comedies of Aristophanes, full of jokes and puns and political satire. There were the dialogues of Plato, exploring questions of justice, truth, and the nature of reality. There were the scientific treatises of Aristotle, on subjects ranging from physics to biology to the proper structure of a tragic play. There were histories, Herodotus on the Persian Wars, Thucydides on the Peloponnesian War, countless lesser historians whose names we have forgotten but whose works were once available in Alexandria's halls. There were medical texts, describing symptoms and treatments, the accumulated wisdom of Greek physicians going back to Hippocrates. There were mathematical treatises, exploring the properties of numbers and shapes. There were astronomical observations, recording the movements of the stars and planets across the night sky. There were books on farming and books on mining, books on horse breeding and books on cookery, books on how to build ships and how to wage war, books on rhetoric, teaching young men how to speak persuasively in the courts and assemblies, books on music, explaining the mathematical relationships between different notes. If someone, somewhere in the Greek world, had written it down, Ptolemy's agents would try to find it. And then Ptolemy devised something even more cunning, the book tax. A law was passed in Alexandria. Every ship that entered the harbour must declare any scrolls it carried on board. Those scrolls would be taken to the library, where scribes would copy them. The originals, supposedly, would be returned to their owners, but often they were not. The library scribes would copy the manuscripts quickly on cheap papyrus, and these hasty copies would be returned to the ships. The originals, the careful, beautiful manuscripts that travellers had cherished and carried across the sea, would remain in Alexandria. It was, by any honest reckoning, a kind of theft. But it was theft in the service of knowledge, and Ptolemy felt no remorse. The books were safer in his library, he reasoned, than scattered across 1,000 ships and 1,000 private collections. Here they would be preserved. Here they would last. The scrolls accumulated faster than anyone had anticipated. Storage became a problem. The modest building that had housed the first collection soon overflowed. Ptolemy ordered construction of a larger facility, a proper library, with reading rooms and storage chambers, with space for scholars to work and scribes to copy. This building rose within the grounds of the royal palace, in the eastern quarter of the city. It was not especially grand by the standards of Alexandrian architecture, no towering columns, no elaborate facades. What made it remarkable was what it contained. Row upon row of shelving, carved from cedar and cypress wood, holding thousands of papyrus scrolls. Each scroll was stored in a cylindrical container called a capsa, and each capsa bore a tag indicating its contents. Labels identified the author, the title, the subject matter, the number of lines. The shelves were organized by subject, poetry in one section, philosophy in another, history in a third. Within each section, the scrolls were arranged alphabetically by author. It was a simple system by modern standards, but in the ancient world it was revolutionary. A scholar looking for a particular text no longer had to search through random piles of scrolls. He could go directly to the right section, find the right shelf, and locate the work he needed. The smell of the library must have been distinctive, the dry, dusty scent of old papyrus, the faint sweetness of the cedarwood shelving, the lingering trace of lamp oil from the reading rooms. On humid days, the papyrus would soften slightly, becoming more pliable under the fingers. On dry days, It would grow crisp and fragile, requiring careful handling. The scribes who worked in the library developed calluses on their fingers from gripping their reed pens. Their eyes grew tired from hours of careful copying, squinting at faded letters on ancient manuscripts. But they took pride in their work. They were not merely clerks. They were the guardians of human memory, preserving the thoughts of the wise for generations yet unborn. For the first time in history, knowledge was being organized. Ptolemy I Soter died around 282 before the Common Era. He had ruled Egypt for more than 40 years, transforming a conquered province into one of the most powerful kingdoms in the Mediterranean world. He had built harbors and temples, armies and fleets. He had defended his realm against rivals who would have torn it apart. But perhaps his greatest achievement was the collection of scrolls that he left behind. A library that already numbered in the tens of thousands, a repository of knowledge unlike anything the world had ever seen. The work of building the library, however, was far from finished. That task would fall to his son. Ptolemy II Philadelphus ascended to the throne of Egypt in his father's final years, first as co-ruler, and then as sole king. He was different from his father in many ways, more refined, more cultured, less interested in warfare, and more interested in the arts of peace. Where Ptolemy I had been a soldier who discovered scholarship late in life, Ptolemy II had been raised as a prince in a city already famous for its learning. He had grown up surrounded by books, by philosophers, by the brightest minds that gold could attract. For him, the library was not a late-life project, but a birthright, and he was determined to make it the wonder of the world. Under Ptolemy II, the book-collecting enterprise expanded dramatically. New agents were dispatched to lands beyond the Greek world. They traveled to Persia, gathering texts on medicine and astronomy that the Persians had preserved from even older civilizations. They went to Babylon, seeking the mathematical and astronomical records that the Chaldean priests had accumulated over centuries of careful observation. They reached out to the Jews, to the Egyptians, to any people who had committed their knowledge to writing. The library's ambition was no longer merely to collect Greek learning. It was to collect all learning, from everywhere, in every language. This required a vast enterprise of translation. Ptolemy II employed teams of scholars who could read foreign languages, men who had learned Hebrew or Aramaic, Egyptian hieratic or Persian cuneiform. These scholars worked in the library's halls, painstakingly translating foreign texts into Greek so that they could be read by the wider community of Alexandrian scholars. The most famous of these translation projects was the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Hebrew scriptures. The story of the Septuagint is worth telling slowly, for it reveals much about the spirit of the library in these early years. According to tradition, Ptolemy II wished to include the sacred books of the Jews in his collection, but the Torah was written in Hebrew, a language that few Alexandrian scholars could read. To make these texts accessible, they would need to be translated into Greek. Ptolemy sent a letter to the high priest in Jerusalem, requesting that learned men be sent to Alexandria to perform this task. The high priest complied, sending 72 scholars, 6 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, along with precious scrolls of the law. The Jewish scholars were received with honor in Alexandria. They were housed in comfortable quarters on the island of Pharos, where they could work in peace, away from the bustle of the city. Each morning, they would wash in the sea, then gather in a great hall to discuss the day's work. They debated the precise meaning of Hebrew words, seeking Greek equivalents that would convey the same nuances. They wrestled with passages that seemed to defy translation, concepts that had no ready parallel in Greek thought. For 72 days, according to legend, they labored over their translation, and when they were finished, they had produced something remarkable, the first Greek version of the Hebrew Bible. The completed translation was read aloud to the Jewish community of Alexandria, who received it with joy. It was then presented to Ptolemy himself, who ordered it placed in the library alongside the Greek and Egyptian texts. For the first time, Greek-speaking people could read the stories of Abraham and Moses, the laws of Sinai, the poetry of the Psalms. Whether every detail of this story is literally true, we cannot say. The number 72 has a suspicious symbolic quality, and the neat time frame of 72 days seems too perfect to be coincidental. But the essential fact is not in doubt. The Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek in Alexandria during the reign of Ptolemy II, and this translation, known as the Septuagint, from the Latin word for 70, became the version of the Jewish Bible that most of the ancient world would know. It was read by Jews throughout the Greek-speaking world. Centuries later, it would be the version quoted by the authors of the New Testament. It shaped the religious thought of millions who never learned Hebrew, never traveled to Jerusalem, never saw the inside of the temple. And it happened because a king in Alexandria wanted every book in the world. The library continued to grow. By the middle of Ptolemy I's reign, the collection had expanded beyond all earlier estimates. Ancient sources claim that it held 200,000 scrolls, then 300,000, then more still. The numbers are difficult to verify, and ancient writers had a tendency toward exaggeration. But even the most conservative estimates suggest a collection far larger than any that had existed before. Where would you put so many scrolls? The answer was that the library was not a single building, but a complex of buildings, a sprawling institution that occupied a significant portion of the royal quarter. The main building was connected to the palace by covered walkways, so that the Ptolemies could visit whenever they wished, browsing the collection or consulting with scholars. Around it clustered smaller structures, annexes and storehouses, built as the collection outgrew its original home. There were reading rooms where scholars could consult the texts, long chambers with good light from windows facing north, where the sun would not fade the precious papyrus. Benches and tables were provided, and slaves stood ready to fetch scrolls from the storage chambers and return them when the reader was finished. There were the storage chambers themselves, lined with shelving, where the scrolls were kept in their capsae, organized and labeled. These rooms were kept as dry as possible, for moisture was the enemy of papyrus. Braziers might be lit in damp weather to drive out the humidity. There were workrooms where copyists labored to produce new copies of damaged or deteriorating manuscripts. Old scrolls grew brittle and faded over time. The library employed teams of scribes whose sole task was to transcribe ancient texts onto fresh papyrus, preserving them for another generation. There were offices where librarians catalogued and organized the ever-expanding collection, maintaining the records that allowed scholars to find what they needed. And there were rooms where scholars could debate and discuss, where ideas could be exchanged and arguments refined. And at the heart of it all was a man with perhaps the most important job in the ancient world, the chief librarian. The position of chief librarian of Alexandria was not merely administrative. It was one of the most prestigious intellectual appointments a scholar could receive. The chief librarian was responsible for the entire collection, for acquiring new texts, for preserving old ones, for organizing the vast repository of human knowledge that had been entrusted to his care. The men who held this position were among the greatest minds of their age. They were poets and scholars, scientists and philosophers. To be named chief librarian was to be recognized as one of the leading intellectuals of the Greek world. We shall meet some of these remarkable men in the chapters to come. But for now, let us pause and consider what had been accomplished. In less than 50 years, a single human lifetime, the Ptolemies had created something unprecedented. They had gathered the scattered knowledge of the ancient world and brought it together in one place. They had employed armies of copyists to preserve texts that might otherwise have been lost. They had commissioned translations of foreign works that Greeks had never been able to read. For the first time in history, a scholar could hope to find almost any book ever written within the walls of a single institution. For the first time, the accumulated wisdom of many civilizations could be compared, cross-referenced, and built upon. This was not just a library. It was an engine of intellectual progress, a catalyst for discovery, a monument to the human hunger for knowledge. And the Ptolemies were not finished yet. The library was only one part of a larger institution, a research center, a community of scholars, a place where the brightest minds of the age could live and work in comfort, free from the ordinary concerns of making a living. This institution was called the Mouseion, the Temple of the Muses. But the Mouseion is a story for another time. For now, let the scrolls rest on their shelves. Let the scribes set down their pens. Let the lamps burn low in the reading rooms of Alexandria. The great collection is assembled. The greatest scholars of the ancient world are beginning to gather, and the golden age of the library is about to begin. Rest now. The Muses will wait. The library was only part of something larger. Surrounding it, connected to it, inseparable from it, was an institution that the Greeks called the Mouseion, the Temple of the Muses. It was here, in the gardens and colonnades of the Mouseion, that the true work of Alexandria's scholars took place. To understand the Mouseion, we must first understand the Muses themselves. In Greek mythology, the Muses were 9 goddesses, daughters of Zeus and Mnemosyne, the goddess of memory. Each muse presided over a different domain of human creativity and knowledge. Together, they represented the full range of intellectual and artistic achievement. Calliope was the muse of epic poetry, the voice that inspired Homer's great works. Clio was the muse of history, watching over those who recorded the deeds of the past. Erato presided over love poetry, her name meaning the lovely one. Euterpe inspired music and lyric poetry. Melpomene watched over tragedy, and Philia brought her blessing to comedy. Polyhymnia was the muse of sacred hymns and eloquence. Terpsichore inspired dance, and Urania, her gaze turned ever upward, was the muse of astronomy. These were not distant, abstract deities to the Greeks. They were present companions, invisible but real, breathing inspiration into mortal minds. When a poet composed a verse that seemed beyond his ordinary abilities, he thanked the Muses. When a mathematician discovered a proof of unexpected elegance, he sensed their guidance. And so when the Ptolemies wished to create a center of learning, they built it as a temple, a sacred space dedicated to these divine patronesses of wisdom. The Mouseion occupied a portion of the royal quarter, adjacent to the palace and the library. It was not a single building, but a complex of structures arranged around gardens and courtyards. Colonnades provided shaded walkways where scholars could stroll and converse. Fountains bubbled gently, their sound providing a constant, soothing backdrop to the life of the mind. At the heart of the Mouseion stood a shrine to the Muses themselves. Here, sacrifices were offered and prayers were said. Here, the scholars who lived within these walls acknowledged that their work was not merely human endeavor, but a form of worship, a pursuit of the divine through the patient accumulation of knowledge. The Ptolemies understood that great minds needed more than books. They needed freedom. Freedom from the daily concerns that occupied ordinary men, the need to earn a living, to find food and shelter, to worry about tomorrow. And so the Mouseion offered something unprecedented. A community of scholars supported entirely by the king. Those chosen to join the Mouseion received free housing within the complex itself. Their rooms were modest but comfortable, private chambers where they could study and rest, opening onto the common areas where they gathered with their colleagues. They ate their meals together in a great dining hall, sharing food and conversation, debating ideas over bread and wine. They paid no rent. They bought no food. Their clothing was provided. They had no duties except to think, to study, to write, to discuss. For men who had spent their lives scraping together tuition fees or seeking wealthy patrons, this must have seemed like paradise. Here, they could devote themselves entirely to their work, knowing that their material needs would be met by the royal treasury. The scholars received a stipend as well, a regular payment that allowed them to purchase books for their personal collections, to employ copyists for their own projects, to travel when their research required it. Some scholars grew wealthy in Alexandria, not from the stipend alone, but from the prestige that their association with the Mouseion brought them. For a famous scholar could command high fees for private tuition. He could dedicate his works to wealthy patrons who would reward him handsomely. He could be invited to other courts, other cities, where kings and magistrates would pay generously for his presence. The Mouseion, in short, was not merely a retreat from the world. It was a launching pad for careers that could span the entire Mediterranean. The physical facilities of the Mouseion were impressive in their own right. Beyond the gardens and colonnades, there were lecture halls where scholars could address larger audiences. These were semicircular rooms with tiered seating, designed so that every member of the audience could see and hear the speaker clearly. Here, visiting dignitaries might be treated to demonstrations of Alexandrian learning. Here, public disputations might be held, with scholars defending their theories against challengers. There were smaller seminar rooms for more intimate discussions. There were workshops where astronomical instruments were built and calibrated. There were laboratories, though the ancients would not have called them that, where physicians could conduct their dissections and alchemists could pursue their experiments. The dining hall deserves particular attention, for it was here that much of the Mouseion's real work took place. The hall was large enough to seat all the resident scholars at once, perhaps 100 men at the height of the institution's prosperity. The tables were arranged in rows, with a raised platform at one end where distinguished guests might sit with the chief librarian and any royal visitors. The food was good, but not extravagant. The Ptolemies understood that scholars required sustenance, but they did not wish to encourage gluttony or distract from intellectual pursuits. Meals were occasions for conversation, not for gormandizing. Wine flowed freely, mixed with water in the Greek fashion. The ancients believed that wine stimulated thought and loosened tongues, that a man who had drunk moderately might speak truths he would hesitate to utter when sober. The Symposium, that ancient Greek institution of drinking and philosophical discussion, found its permanent home in the dining hall of the Mouseion. After the main meal, the tables might be cleared and the serious drinking begun. Scholars would propose toasts and answer them. They would recite poetry and challenge each other to extemporize. They would debate the great questions, the nature of justice, the origin of the universe, the proper conduct of life. These evenings could stretch late into the night, until the wine ran out or the participants grew too drowsy to continue. But the Mouseion was not a monastery. The scholars were not expected to withdraw from the world in silent contemplation. On the contrary, they were encouraged to engage with one another, to debate and discuss, to challenge and refine one another's ideas. The dining hall was the heart of this intellectual community. Imagine the scene. Long tables set with simple fare, fresh bread, olives and cheese, fish from the harbour, wine mixed with water in the Greek fashion. Dozens of scholars seated together, men from different cities and different disciplines, united by their residence in Alexandria. At one table, mathematicians argue about the properties of prime numbers. At another, poets discuss the merits of different meters for different subjects. Historians compare sources, trying to reconcile conflicting accounts of the Persian Wars. Physicians debate whether disease arises from imbalances in the body's humors or from external causes like bad air. The conversations continued long after the food was finished. They spilled out into the gardens, where scholars walked in pairs or small groups, their voices rising and falling in the evening air. They continued in the colonnades, where torches burned late into the night. The Mouseion had no formal curriculum. There were no lectures that all scholars were required to attend, no examinations to pass, no degrees to earn. This was not a school in any modern sense. Instead, knowledge was transmitted through informal relationships, through conversation, through mentorship, through the slow accumulation of understanding that comes from spending years in the company of brilliant minds. A young scholar newly arrived from Athens might attach himself to an older master, reading the same texts, attending the same discussions, gradually absorbing the older man's methods and insights. In time, he might begin to develop his own ideas, to make his own contributions, to attract students of his own. The subjects studied in the Mouseion were as varied as the Muses themselves. Poetry was a central concern. The Alexandrian scholars developed techniques of textual criticism that are still used today, comparing different manuscript copies, identifying errors introduced by generations of copyists, trying to reconstruct what the original author had actually written. They produced definitive editions of Homer and the great tragedians, establishing the texts that we still read today. History flourished in the Mouseion's halls. The scholars had access to documents from across the ancient world, diplomatic correspondence, royal archives, records of treaties and campaigns. They could consult primary sources that would later be lost, building comprehensive histories of regions and periods that we can only glimpse today through their summaries and fragments. Philosophy was debated in the gardens. The Ptolemies brought together representatives of different schools, Platonists and Aristotelians, Stoics and Epicureans. These thinkers did not always agree. Indeed, they often disagreed violently, accusing each other of error and ignorance. But from their arguments, from the clash of ideas, and the demand for rigorous justification, understanding deepened. Medicine advanced through observation, and, in ways that might disturb modern sensibilities, through experimentation. The Ptolemaic kings granted the Mouseions physicians permission to dissect human bodies, a practice forbidden in most of the ancient world. For the first time, doctors could study human anatomy directly, rather than inferring it from the bodies of animals. Their discoveries transformed medical understanding. But perhaps the greatest achievements of the Mouseion were in mathematics and astronomy. Here, in the clear skies of Alexandria, scholars observed the heavens with unprecedented care. They tracked the movements of the sun and moon and planets. They measured the lengths of shadows at different times of year. They developed mathematical models to explain what they observed, and they made discoveries that would not be surpassed for centuries. But these are stories for later chapters. For now, let us simply note that the Mouseion brought together the greatest mathematical minds of the age, provided them with resources and freedom, and created conditions in which genius could flourish. At the head of this remarkable institution stood the chief librarian. We mentioned this position briefly in our last chapter, but it deserves more attention here. The chief librarian was not merely an administrator of scrolls. He was the leading figure of the entire Mouseion, its public face, its representative to the king, its chief intellectual authority. The first chief librarians were chosen by the Ptolemies themselves, hand-picked for their learning and their administrative abilities. They were among the most respected scholars of their generation, men whose opinions carried weight throughout the Greek world. The chief librarian's duties were many. He oversaw the acquisition of new texts and the preservation of old ones. He made decisions about how the collection should be organized. He resolved disputes between scholars about the correct reading of ambiguous passages. But perhaps his most important role was as a kind of intellectual gatekeeper. He decided which scholars would be invited to join the Mouseion, which young men showed enough promise to deserve support, which fields of study would receive special attention. Through these decisions, the chief librarian shaped the direction of ancient scholarship for generations to come. The scholars of the Mouseion came from across the Greek world. Some were born Alexandrians, raised in the shadow of the library and destined from childhood to join its community. But most came from elsewhere, from Athens and Corinth, from Rhodes and Pergamon, from Syracuse and the cities of Asia Minor. They were drawn by the library's collection, of course. Where else could a scholar find so many texts gathered in one place? A historian working on the Peloponnesian War might spend years tracking down scattered sources, or he could come to Alexandria and find them all on the same set of shelves. But they were also drawn by the community itself. Scholarship, for all its emphasis on solitary study, is ultimately a social activity. Ideas must be tested against other minds. Arguments must be refined through debate. A brilliant insight is worth nothing if it cannot be communicated to others. At the Mouseion, a scholar could find colleagues who understood his work, who could appreciate its significance, who could point out its flaws and suggest improvements. He could find students to carry on his legacy. He could find rivals to keep him sharp. This critical mass of talent was self-reinforcing. The more brilliant minds gathered in Alexandria, the more attractive the Mouseion became to other brilliant minds. Success bred success, until Alexandria stood alone as the intellectual capital of the ancient world. The scholars were not always harmonious in their interactions. Where strong opinions meet, conflict is inevitable. The dining hall saw its share of bitter arguments, of accusations and counter-accusations, of long-running feuds between scholars who could not bear to share the same table. Some disputes were scholarly, disagreements about the correct interpretation of a text, or the validity of a proof, or the proper methods for investigating nature. These could be heated, but they were ultimately productive. Out of disagreement came refinement, and out of refinement came progress. Other disputes were personal, clashes of ego, competition for recognition, jealousy of a rival's success. These were less productive, but they were perhaps inevitable in any community of ambitious men. The Ptolemies, for their part, generally allowed the scholars to manage their own affairs. They provided the money and the protection. How the scholars used these resources was largely up to them. But the kings also understood the value of their investment. A Ptolemy who wished to understand a fine point of law could summon a legal expert from the Mouseion. A Ptolemy who needed to know the history of a disputed territory could consult the historians. A Ptolemy who wanted to impress a foreign ambassador could show off the marvels of Alexandrian learning. The scholars were an ornament to the kingdom, a source of prestige that enhanced Ptolemaic power throughout the Mediterranean world. Let us linger for a moment in the gardens of the Mouseion. It is early evening. The heat of the day has passed, and a gentle breeze blows in from the harbour. The sky is turning from blue to gold to pink. Somewhere nearby, a fountain splashes softly. In the colonnade, two philosophers walk slowly, deep in discussion. Their voices are low, their gestures measured. They are debating the nature of the good life, whether it consists in pleasure, as the Epicureans claim, or in virtue, as the Stoics insist. On a bench beneath an olive tree, an old mathematician sits with a young student. The old man draws figures in the sand with a stick, explaining a proof. The young man leans forward, concentrating, occasionally asking a question. This is how knowledge passes from generation to generation, not through formal lectures, but through patient, personal instruction. At the edge of the garden, near the wall that separates the Mouseion from the rest of the palace complex, a poet composes verses in his head. He walks slowly, his lips moving silently, trying out different combinations of words. Later, he will write down what he has composed, but first, it must sound right in his inner ear. And in the library itself, lights begin to appear in the windows. The day's work is ending, but some scholars will continue late into the night, copying texts by lamplight, reading until their eyes grow heavy, falling asleep at last with scrolls still spread across their tables. This is the Mouseion at its height, a community of minds dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge, supported by royal generosity, preserved for future generations in the scrolls of the library. The institution would endure for centuries, outlasting the Ptolemies themselves. Even after Rome conquered Egypt, even after the old religion gave way to new faiths, the Mouseion continued in some form, diminished, changed, but still recognizable. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. At this point in our story, the Mouseion is young and flourishing. The greatest scholars of the age are gathering in Alexandria, drawn by the promise of books and community and freedom. In the next chapter, we shall meet some of them. Rest now. The scholars will wait. The gardens of the Mouseion are quiet in the evening. The fountains splash softly. The colonnades are empty. The debates adjourned until tomorrow. Over the centuries, the Mouseion attracted the greatest minds of the ancient world. Let us meet some of them now, the geometers and astronomers, the poets and physicians, whose work would shape human knowledge for millennia to come. But that is a story for another time. For now, the lamps are burning low, the scrolls rest on their shelves, and the Mediterranean night wraps Alexandria in quiet darkness. Now let us meet the minds that made the library immortal. Over the centuries of its existence, the Mouseion attracted scholars whose names still resonate today, men who laid the foundations of mathematics, astronomy, geography, and medicine. Their works would be studied for 2,000 years. Their methods would shape the development of Western science. Let us begin with geometry. Euclid came to Alexandria sometime around 300 before the Common Era, during the reign of Ptolemy I. We know almost nothing about his life, where he was born, who his teachers were, how he came to settle in Egypt. He is a shadow, a name attached to one of the most influential books ever written. That book was The Elements. The Elements was not a book of original discoveries. Euclid was not the first to prove the theorems it contains. What Euclid did was more subtle and, in some ways, more important. He organized. He systematized. He took the scattered discoveries of earlier mathematicians and arranged them into a logical structure of breathtaking elegance. The Elements begins with definitions and axioms, statements so basic that they cannot be proved, but must simply be accepted. A point is that which has no part. A line is length without breadth. Through any 2 points, a straight line can be drawn. From these simple beginnings, Euclid built an entire world. Proposition followed proposition, each one proved from the ones that came before. The Pythagorean theorem, that the square of the hypotenuse equals the sum of the squares of the other 2 sides. Euclid proved it. The properties of parallel lines, Euclid established them. The nature of circles and triangles and polygons, Euclid laid them bare. And at the end, in the final books of the Elements, Euclid reached the culmination of Greek geometry. The 5 Platonic solids, those perfect 3-dimensional shapes, the tetrahedron, the cube, the octahedron, the dodecahedron, the icosahedron, that Plato had believed to be the building blocks of the physical world. The story is told that Ptolemy I, curious about this geometry that his scholars praised so highly, asked Euclid whether there was a shorter way to learn the subject than by working through all the propositions. Euclid's reply has echoed through the ages. "There is no royal road to geometry," he said. "Even a king must walk the path step by step, proving each theorem before proceeding to the next." The Elements would become the most successful textbook in human history. For more than 2,000 years, students learned geometry from Euclid's book, not just in the Greek world, but in the Islamic civilization that preserved it through the medieval period, and in the European Renaissance that rediscovered it. Abraham Lincoln taught himself logic by working through Euclid. Albert Einstein, as a boy, was enchanted by the elegant proofs. The elements shaped how we think about mathematical proof, about logical argument, about the very nature of knowledge. And it was written in Alexandria, in the shadow of the library, by a man about whom we know almost nothing except his work. Let us turn now to another giant, Archimedes. Archimedes was not an Alexandrian by birth. He came from Syracuse, a Greek city on the island of Sicily, far to the west of Egypt. But at some point in his youth, he traveled to Alexandria to study, and there he encountered the mathematical tradition that would shape his life's work. In Alexandria, Archimedes would have met scholars working on problems of geometry and mechanics. He would have had access to the library's collection of mathematical texts, the works of Euclid, still fresh, and the older treatises that Euclid had drawn upon. He would have learned the methods of rigorous proof that characterized Alexandrian mathematics, and then he returned to Syracuse, where he spent the rest of his life making discoveries that would not be surpassed for nearly 2 millennia. Archimedes calculated the value of pi more accurately than anyone before him. He discovered the principles of the lever and the pulley. He invented the Archimedes screw, a device for raising water that is still used today. He determined the surface area and volume of a sphere, a result he was so proud of that he asked for a sphere inscribed in a cylinder to be carved on his tombstone. And he discovered the principle that bears his name, that a body immersed in fluid experiences an upward force equal to the weight of the fluid it displaces. The legend says that Archimedes discovered this principle in his bath. He had been asked to determine whether a golden crown made for the king contained any silver, but to do so without damaging the crown. As he lowered himself into the water and watched it rise, the solution came to him in a flash. He leaped from the bath and ran naked through the streets of Syracuse, shouting, "Eureka! Eureka! I have found it! I have found it!" Whether the story is literally true, we cannot say, but it captures something essential about Archimedes: the intensity of his focus, the joy he took in discovery, the single-minded devotion to understanding that marked his entire life. When Roman soldiers finally conquered Syracuse after a long siege, they found Archimedes bent over a mathematical diagram, lost in contemplation. A soldier commanded him to come along. Archimedes, absorbed in his work, waved him away. "Do not disturb my circles," he said. The soldier, enraged, killed him on the spot. Let us turn to astronomy. In Alexandria, scholars looked up at the night sky and asked questions that seemed simple, but proved extraordinarily difficult to answer. How far away is the sun? How large is the Earth? Do the planets move around the Earth, or does the Earth move around the sun? Aristarchus of Samos proposed a radical answer to the last question. 18 centuries before Copernicus, he suggested that the Earth revolves around the sun, not the other way around. He had calculated that the sun must be vastly larger than the Earth, and it seemed absurd to him that a larger body should orbit a smaller one. But his contemporaries were not convinced. The Earth does not feel as though it is moving. If it were, why would objects not fly off into space? Why would a stone thrown straight up come straight back down, rather than landing somewhere to the west? Aristarchus could not answer these objections. His heliocentric theory was forgotten, and the Earth-centered model of the cosmos would dominate until the Renaissance. But other Alexandrian astronomers made discoveries that would endure. Eratosthenes of Cyrene, who served as chief librarian of Alexandria, performed one of the most elegant experiments in the history of science. He measured the circumference of the Earth. Eratosthenes had learned that in the city of Syene, far to the south of Alexandria, the sun stood directly overhead at noon on the summer solstice. A vertical stick cast no shadow. The sun's rays fell straight down into a deep well, illuminating its bottom. But in Alexandria, on the same day, and at the same time, the sun was not directly overhead. A vertical stick cast a shadow. By measuring the angle of this shadow, Eratosthenes could calculate how far Alexandria was from Syene, not in miles, but in degrees of the Earth's curve. He found that the angle was about 7 degrees, roughly 1/50th of a complete circle. He knew that the distance from Alexandria to Syene was about 5,000 stadia. If this distance represented 1/50th of the Earth's circumference, then the total circumference must be about 250,000 stadia. Converting to modern units is tricky, because we are not entirely sure how long an Egyptian stadium was. But Eratosthenes' result was remarkably close to the true value. Within a few percent of the 40,000 kilometers we now know the circumference to be. Using nothing but a stick, a shadow, and pure reason, an Alexandrian scholar had measured the size of the planet. Let us speak of Hipparchus. Hipparchus worked at Alexandria and at Rhodes during the 2nd century before the Common Era. He was perhaps the greatest astronomer of antiquity, a careful observer and a brilliant theorist who created a catalogue of the stars, developed methods for predicting eclipses, and discovered the precession of the equinoxes. The precession of the equinoxes is a slow wobble in the Earth's axis of rotation. Over a period of about 26,000 years, the axis traces out a complete circle in the sky. This means that the position of the stars relative to the seasons gradually shifts, so gradually that it takes centuries to notice. Hipparchus noticed. By comparing his own observations with records made by earlier astronomers, he detected the shift. This was observational science at its finest, patient, careful, spanning generations. Let us turn briefly to medicine. Herophilus and Erasistratus were physicians who worked in Alexandria during the 3rd century before the Common Era. They were pioneers of human dissection, taking advantage of the Ptolemies' permission to study the bodies of executed criminals. What they discovered transformed medical understanding. Herophilus identified the brain as the seat of intelligence, overturning the older view that the heart was the center of thought. He distinguished between sensory nerves and motor nerves. He described the anatomy of the eye, the liver, the reproductive organs. Erasistratus studied the heart and the blood vessels. He came tantalizingly close to discovering the circulation of the blood, a discovery that would have to wait for William Harvey, 18 centuries later. And let us not forget the poets. Callimachus served as a scholar in the library, where he compiled the Pinnaces, a catalogue of all the library's holdings, organized by author and subject. It was the first library catalogue in history, a work of scholarship as significant in its way as any mathematical treatise. But Callimachus was also a poet, famous for his elegant, learned verses. He favored short poems over long epics, polished craft over sprawling invention. Better a small perfection, he believed, than a large mediocrity. His rival Apollonius of Rhodes disagreed. Apollonius wrote the Argonautica, an epic poem telling the story of Jason and the quest for the Golden Fleece. The two poets quarreled bitterly. Their dispute became one of the great literary controversies of the ancient world. Both men served as chief librarian of Alexandria. Both shaped the literary culture of their age, and both would be read and imitated for centuries to come. These are only some of the scholars who walked the gardens of the Mouseion, who consulted the scrolls of the library, who added their own contributions to the great edifice of human knowledge. There were geographers who mapped the known world. There were linguists who studied the grammar of Greek and the relationship between languages. There were engineers who built war machines and water clocks and automata that could move and speak. The Mouseion was a universe of minds, each pursuing its own questions, all supported by the wealth of the Ptolemies and the resources of the library. What would it have been like to walk among them? Imagine yourself a young student, newly arrived from Greece. You have heard stories of the library all your life, and now you are finally here. The city is vast and bewildering, larger than any you have ever seen. The streets are crowded with merchants and sailors, with Egyptian priests and Greek soldiers. But you make your way to the royal quarter, to the Mouseion's gates. You present your letter of introduction, and you are admitted. Inside, the noise of the city fades. The gardens are peaceful, the colonnades quiet. You see scholars walking in pairs, deep in discussion. You see students sitting at the feet of masters, taking notes on wax tablets. You smell the dry scent of papyrus, hear the scratch of reed pens on paper. This is the center of the world's learning, and you have been admitted. Rest now. The scholars' work continues, but you need not follow every proof and demonstration. Let their voices fade into the background, the murmur of discussion, the gentle arguments, the patient explanations. But what was it like to spend an ordinary day in this extraordinary place? What did a scholar see and hear and smell as he went about his work? That is the story of our next chapter. Let us spend a day in the library, not as tourists glimpsing wonders from afar, but as scholars going about our ordinary work. Let us feel the texture of the papyrus, smell the ink and the dust, hear the sounds that filled these ancient halls. Come, settle into this imagined life. Let it become, for a while, as real as your own. It is early morning. The sun has not yet risen. The world is still and dark. The stars are fading, one by one, as the eastern sky begins to pale. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crows, the first voice of the coming day. You wake in your small chamber within the Mouseion complex. For a moment, you lie still, letting consciousness return gradually, like water seeping into parched earth. The room is simple, a narrow bed with a straw mattress covered in linen, a wooden chest for your belongings, a desk where you can work by lamplight. The walls are whitewashed, cool to the touch even in summer. A single oil lamp sits on the desk, its wick trimmed and ready for the night's work that never came. You fell asleep early, exhausted from the previous day's labor. Through the small window, you can see the first pale light gathering in the eastern sky. The color is not yet pink or gold, but simply gray, that quiet gray that comes before color, before warmth, before the world remembers that it is alive. You breathe. The air is cool and still, carrying the faint scent of the sea. Alexandria wakes slowly around you, but the Mouseion remains quiet. This is the hour between night and day, when neither darkness nor light has claimed the world. You rise and dress in the simple robes appropriate to a scholar. First, the chiton, a rectangle of undyed linen, soft from many washings, draped over your shoulders and pinned at the sides. Then the hymation, a heavier cloak that you wrap around yourself against the morning chill. The fabric is plain but comfortable. Scholars do not dress for fashion. They dress for work. You slip sandals onto your feet. The leather is supple, molded over months of wearing to the shape of your feet. They make a soft sound against the stone floor as you cross the room. At the door, you pause. You look back at your chamber, the rumpled bed, the waiting desk, the small possessions that mark this space as yours. Then you step out into the cool morning air. The colonnades are empty at this hour. Row upon row of marble columns stretch into the dimness, their shapes barely visible in the pre-dawn light. Your footsteps echo softly on the marble floors, the only sound in the sleeping complex. A few other early risers are about, fellow scholars who, like you, prefer to begin their work before the heat of the day descends. You exchange nods as you pass. No one speaks. The silence of early morning feels sacred, not to be broken by casual words. The colonnade opens onto a small courtyard. In its center stands a fountain, its waters still in the quiet air. The basin is carved from a single block of Egyptian granite, dark and smooth and ancient. You approach and cup your hands beneath the spout. The water is cool, drawn from deep cisterns beneath the palace complex where the sun never reaches. You splash it on your face, feeling the shock of it against your skin, cold and clean and pure. The water runs down your cheeks, your neck, dampening the collar of your chiton. You shake your head, droplets flying, and feel yourself waking more fully. The fog of sleep lifts. Your mind begins to sharpen. To anticipate the work ahead, you dry your face on a corner of your hymation and continue on. The path to the dining hall winds through gardens that are still wrapped in shadow. Date palms stand like silent sentinels, their fronds motionless in the still air. Beneath them, beds of herbs release their fragrance, rosemary and thyme, mint and coriander. A cat crosses your path, orange and sleek, on some mysterious feline errand. It pauses to regard you with amber eyes, then slips away into the shadows. The dining hall is a long, low building with open sides facing the gardens. In summer, the breeze flows through freely. In winter, heavy curtains can be drawn to keep out the chill. Now, in spring, the curtains are tied back, and the morning air circulates gently through the space. The hall is nearly empty. A few servants move quietly, setting out platters, filling amphorae with wine. They work with the practiced efficiency of people who have done this work 1,000 times before. Breakfast is a simple affair. Bread, yesterday's bread, dense and chewy, good for dipping. Olives, black and briny, preserved in oil. A wedge of sharp cheese. Figs, dried and wrinkled, but still sweet. A cup of wine mixed with water, the standard drink of the ancient world, safer than water alone and more nourishing. You sit at a long wooden table, worn smooth by generations of scholars. The surface is marked with rings from cups, stains from spilled wine, small gouges from careless knives. Each mark tells a story of meals shared, conversations held, ideas exchanged. You eat slowly, deliberately. There is no rush. The food is simple but satisfying, filling your stomach without weighing you down. You will need energy for the morning's work, the close reading, the careful comparison, the concentration required to understand texts written centuries ago. A servant refills your cup. You nod in thanks. The wine is thin but pleasant, cutting the dryness of the bread, complementing the salt of the olives. Through the open sides of the dining hall, you can see the sky brightening. Pink now touches the horizon, and the first true light begins to illuminate the gardens. The day is arriving, slowly but surely, as it has arrived every morning since the world began. You finish your meal and push back from the table. A few other early scholars have joined you, scattered along the benches, but no one has spoken. The morning's quiet persists. You make your way toward the library. The path takes you through the heart of the Mouseion complex. You pass the lecture halls where, later in the day, philosophers will teach their students. You pass the observatory tower where astronomers will wait for nightfall to make their measurements. You pass the anatomical theatre where physicians will demonstrate the structures of the body. All is quiet now. The work of the day has not yet begun. The library building rises before you, its walls catching the first golden light of morning. The structure is not as tall as the great temples, but it is substantial, built to last, built to hold the weight of all human knowledge. The entrance is flanked by columns, modest compared to the columned porticos of the Serapeum, but dignified nonetheless. Above the door, an inscription dedicates the building to the Muses, those 9 goddesses who inspire all creative and intellectual endeavor. You pause for a moment at the threshold. Each time you enter, you feel a small thrill of wonder. Inside these walls lies more knowledge than any single person could absorb in 100 lifetimes. And yet here you are, invited to partake of it, welcome to add your own small contribution to the great accumulation. You pass through the entrance and into a vestibule, where attendants wait to assist visitors. The vestibule is cool and dim, the walls lined with niches holding small statues of the Muses themselves. You recognize Clio, the muse of history, holding her scroll, Urania, the muse of astronomy, with her celestial globe, Calliope, the muse of epic poetry, her wax tablet ready for writing. The attendants know you by sight now. You have been here for 3 years, and they nod in greeting as you pass. You are no longer a newcomer, a visitor, an outsider. You belong here. This is your place. From the vestibule, you enter the main hall of the library. The space opens before you, vast and serene. The ceiling is high, supported by columns of Egyptian granite, polished until they gleam. The floor is marble, cool beneath your sandals, echoing softly with each step. On either side, alcoves open off the central space. Each alcove is lined with shelving, wooden shelves of cedar and cypress, fragrant and resistant to insects. And on those shelves rest the scrolls, thousands of them, tens of thousands, each one a vessel of human thought. The smell is distinctive and, to you, deeply familiar. It is the smell of papyrus, dry and dusty, faintly sweet, with undertones of the oil used to preserve the scrolls and the cedar of the shelving. There are notes of old ink, of dried gum, of the leather straps that bind some volumes. It is the smell of knowledge itself. You sometimes think. The smell of accumulated human wisdom. The smell of centuries of thinking and writing and copying and preserving. You breathe it in like perfume. Light enters the hall through windows set high in the walls. The windows face north, carefully positioned to admit light without allowing direct sunlight to fall upon the precious scrolls. Sunlight fades papyrus, bleaches ink, hastens decay. The architects understood this. They built a building that would protect its contents. At this early hour, the light is soft and diffuse. It fills the hall with a gentle glow, illuminating the columns, the shelves, the scrolls, without harshness or glare. The library is quiet. Only a few others are here, early risers like yourself, or night workers who have not yet gone to bed. You see one such scholar bent over his work at a reading desk, his oil lamp still burning though dawn has come. He is copying a manuscript, his reed pen moving steadily across a fresh scroll, reproducing the text of an older, fragile original. You pause to watch him for a moment. The work of copying is tedious and demanding. Every letter must be formed correctly. Every word must be spelled precisely. A single error can corrupt a text for generations to come, and yet the work is essential. Without copying, the ancient texts would crumble and be lost. The scribe does not look up. He is absorbed in his work, in the rhythm of pen and papyrus, in the transfer of knowledge from old to new. You continue on, your sandals making soft sounds on the marble floor. You know exactly where you are going. You have been working on a particular project for months now, a commentary on one of Plato's dialogues. The scrolls you need are kept in the philosophy section, 3 alcoves down on the left. The philosophy section is one of the largest in the library. Plato and Aristotle are well represented, of course. Their works fill dozens of capsi. But there are also the Stoics and Epicureans, the skeptics and cynics, the peripatetics and academics. There are commentaries on commentaries, debates that have continued for generations, texts that argue with other texts that argue with still older texts. You find your place at a reading desk, a sloped surface of polished wood where a scroll can be unrolled and weighted at the corners. The desk is positioned beneath one of the north-facing windows, which provides good natural light without harsh shadows. A small inkpot and a bundle of reed pens rest in a groove at the top of the desk. A stack of blank wax tablets waits for your notes. Everything is ready. Everything is arranged for the work of scholarship. You signal to an attendant. He approaches, and you tell him which scrolls you need. He disappears into the shelves and returns moments later with a stack of capsi, cylindrical leather containers, each one holding a single scroll. You take up the first capsa and remove its contents. The scroll is wrapped in a linen cover, tied with a leather strap. A small tag attached to the strap identifies the contents. Plato's Phaedo, copied in Alexandria during the reign of Ptolemy III, checked against the edition of Aristarchus. You untie the strap, remove the cover, and unroll the scroll onto your reading desk. The papyrus is smooth beneath your fingers, slightly yellowed with age but still supple and strong. Neat Greek letters march across the surface in careful columns, the handwriting of some long-dead scribe who dedicated his life to preservation. This is Plato's Phaedo, the dialogue in which Socrates discusses the immortality of the soul on the day of his death. It is one of the foundational texts of Western philosophy, read and debated and interpreted for over 300 years. And now you hold it in your hands. You unroll the scroll slowly, searching for the passage you were working on yesterday. The papyrus whispers against the wooden weights as you turn it. Column after column of text passes before your eyes. Here it is, Socrates explaining why the philosopher should not fear death, why the soul that has devoted itself to wisdom need not tremble at the prospect of leaving the body behind. You read the passage carefully, then again, then a third time. You compare this copy with another version you have consulted. There are slight differences in wording, variant readings that might change the meaning. Which is correct? Which represents what Plato actually wrote, and which is an error introduced by some long-ago copyist? This is the work of scholarship, not discovery in the dramatic sense, not the flash of insight that solves a long-standing problem. Rather, the patient, careful, meticulous examination of texts, comparing, annotating, weighing evidence, forming judgments. It is quiet work. It is slow work. But it matters. Every corrupted text that is corrected, every disputed reading that is resolved, every obscure passage that is clarified, each of these small victories adds to human understanding. You make notes on your wax tablet. You consult a lexicon for the precise meaning of an unusual word. You trace a reference to another dialogue, fetching a second scroll from the shelves to check the passage. The work absorbs you. You lose track of time. The world outside the library, the gardens, the harbour, the city beyond, all of it fades away. There is only the text, only the words, only the endless fascinating puzzle of interpretation. The library fills with other scholars going about their own work. You are vaguely aware of movement around you, of voices murmuring in other alcoves, of the soft sound of sandals on the marble floor. But you remain absorbed in your text, turning the scroll, making notes, occasionally pausing to think. The light shifts as the sun rises higher. The morning coolness gives way to warmth, then to heat. An attendant passes through the hall, adjusting blinds to keep the direct sunlight from falling on the precious scrolls. You barely notice. You are lost in the 4th century before the Common Era, in a prison cell in Athens, listening to Socrates discuss the soul. At midday, a bell sounds, the summons to the common meal. You look up. startled to realize how much time has passed. Your eyes are tired from reading. You have been squinting at the small Greek letters for hours. Your back aches from bending over the desk. Your fingers are stained with ink from the notes you have been making, but there is also satisfaction in the work you have accomplished, a difficult passage clarified, a variant reading explained, a small contribution to the understanding of a great text. You carefully roll up the scrolls you have been using. The papyrus curls naturally, returning to its stored shape. You replace each scroll in its capsa, tie the leather strap, and return the whole to the attendant. He marks them in his records, which scrolls were consulted, by whom, on what date. The library keeps careful track of its holdings. Every scroll is accounted for. Every consultation is documented. The attendant carries the capsae back to their places on the shelves. The scrolls will rest there until you return tomorrow, or until some other scholar has need of them. You stand and stretch. Your muscles are stiff from hours of sitting. You roll your shoulders, bend your neck, feel the joints pop and crack as they loosen. Around you, other scholars are doing the same, putting away their work, rising from their desks, preparing for the midday break. The library empties gradually, its readers drifting toward the dining hall like leaves carried by a gentle current. The dining hall is crowded at midday. The long tables are filled with scholars from every corner of the Greek world, Athenians and Spartans, Corinthians and Thebans, men from Asia Minor and the islands and the distant colonies. They talk and argue over their food, gesturing with bread, punctuating points with swigs of wine. The sound is a pleasant rumble, dozens of conversations happening simultaneously, blending into a comfortable hum. You find a seat near some colleagues, men who share your interest in philosophy, who can appreciate the problems you are working on. One is from Athens, a student of the academy. Another is from Rhodes, where the Stoics have a strong following. A third is from Syracuse, the city that produced Archimedes. The meal is substantial but not elaborate. There is bread, fresh baked this time, still warm from the ovens. Fish, sea bass grilled with herbs, caught in the harbour that morning. Vegetables, lentils and onions and leeks, cooked with olive oil and garlic. Fruit, grapes and pomegranates and figs, ripe and sweet. The food is nourishing without being distracting. The Ptolemies understand that their scholars need sustenance, not luxury. A man who has eaten too heavily cannot think clearly. A man who is stuffed with delicacies will fall asleep at his desk. You eat with appetite, enjoying the flavors, refueling for the afternoon ahead. The conversation flows around you. Your colleague from Athens describes a problem in Aristotle that has been troubling him, a passage in the physics that seems to contradict a passage in the metaphysics. Another has a theory about the proper interpretation of a disputed passage in Homer, whether the original text said, "the wine-dark sea," or "the wine-faced sea." A third has heard news from the wider world. A philosopher in Athens has proposed a new theory that challenges accepted views on the nature of perception. A mathematician in Syracuse has solved a problem that had resisted attack for generations. A historian in Pergamon has discovered new sources that shed light on the wars of Alexander's successors. Ideas are exchanged, criticisms offered, suggestions made. This is the intellectual life of the Mouseion, not just solitary reading, but conversation, debate, the testing of ideas against other minds. A scholar who reads alone may convince himself of many things. A scholar who talks with colleagues must defend his views, justify his reasoning, respond to objections. The process is humbling and essential. After the meal, you walk in the gardens with a friend. The afternoon heat is intense now, and the colonnades provide welcome shade. You stroll slowly, in no hurry, letting your food digest. The white marble of the columns gleams in the sunlight. The shadows they cast are sharp and dark. Fountains splash softly, their sound cooling even when the water itself is out of reach. The gardens are planted with trees and shrubs that can withstand the Egyptian heat, date palms and acacias, oleanders and tamarisks. Their leaves rustle in the occasional breeze that wanders in from the sea. Your friend is an astronomer. His name is Apollonius, and he has been at the Mouseion for nearly a decade. His skin is weathered from long nights spent on the observation tower, watching the stars wheel overhead. He tells you about observations he has been making, the movements of a particular planet, anomalies that do not fit the accepted model of the heavens. The planet seems to speed up and slow down as it crosses the sky. Sometimes it even appears to move backward, retracing its path for weeks before resuming its forward motion. The model says it should move smoothly, Apollonius explains. The model says all celestial bodies move in perfect circles at constant speeds. But that is not what I see. You listen and ask questions. You do not pretend to understand the mathematics of astronomical prediction, the circles within circles, the epicycles and deference that track the wandering stars. But you can appreciate the problem. The tension between theory and observation, the challenge of making sense of a complex world, the uncomfortable possibility that what everyone believes might be wrong. Perhaps the observations are in error, you suggest. Apollonius shakes his head. I have checked them many times. I have compared them with observations made by others, going back centuries. The anomalies are real. You walk in silence for a while, thinking about what this means. If the observations are correct and the model is wrong, then the model must be revised. But the model has been accepted for generations. It is taught in every school, defended by every authority. Challenging it will not be easy. What will you do? You ask. Keep observing, Apollonius says. Keep recording. Perhaps someday, someone will find a new model that fits the facts better. You part ways at the edge of the gardens. Apollonius heads for the observation tower, where he will prepare for tonight's work. You return to the library, but you do not take up your morning's project. The afternoon is too warm for close reading, and your mind is too full of questions about planets and models and the possibility of error. Instead, you browse. You wander through the alcoves, examining scrolls that catch your attention. The library is vast, and you have explored only a fraction of it. Each visit reveals something new. Here is a collection of Egyptian myths, translated into Greek. Stories of Osiris and Isis, of Ra and Anubis, of gods and goddesses with animal heads and human bodies. The myths are strange to Greek ears, but fascinating, a window into a civilization far older than your own. Here is a treatise on agriculture, explaining the proper seasons for planting and harvesting, the best techniques for irrigation, the crops that thrive in different soils. It is practical knowledge, the accumulated wisdom of generations of farmers. You would never have sought it out, but now that you have found it, you read with interest. Here is a medical text, describing symptoms and treatments for various ailments, fevers and infections, fractures and wounds, disorders of the digestion and the humors. The physician who wrote it was systematic, careful, scientific. He based his recommendations on observation, not superstition. His methods would not seem entirely foreign to a doctor today. Here is a history of wars that took place before you were born, in lands you have never visited. Kings and generals, battles and sieges, alliances made and broken. The details are foreign, but the patterns are familiar. Ambition and fear, courage and folly, the endless human struggle for power. The library contains multitudes. A lifetime would not be enough to read all that is preserved here, but the attempt itself, the effort to understand, to connect, to see the world through many different eyes that is worth making. You select a scroll at random and settle into an alcove to read. It is a collection of poems, lyrics written for performance at festivals and symposia. The language is elegant, the emotions vivid, love and longing, joy and grief, the whole range of human feeling captured in carefully crafted verses. You read until the light begins to fade. The afternoon passes quietly. The library is drowsy in the heat, its readers scattered through the alcoves, some working, some dozing, some lost in thought. The only sounds are the rustling of scrolls and the occasional murmur of voices. Evening comes. The lamps are lit throughout the library, their flames casting warm pools of light in the gathering darkness. The oil lamps give off a soft glow and a faint smell of burning, not unpleasant, but distinctive. The light flickers gently, making the shadows dance. Some scholars continue their work by lamplight. The scribes in particular prefer the evening hours, when the library is quiet and they can copy without distraction. But most readers have retired to the dining hall for the evening meal. You return your borrowed scroll and make your way through the colonnade. The air is cooler now, the heat of the day finally breaking. Stars are beginning to appear in the eastern sky. The dining hall is busy but not crowded. Scholars drift in and out, finding seats, filling plates, joining conversations. The atmosphere is more relaxed than at midday. The serious work of the day is done, and the evening is a time for companionship and reflection. The meal is longer than the midday one, more leisurely. The serious eating is done early. Bread and meat, cheese and vegetables, the good wine that is reserved for evening. And then the cups are refilled, and the conversation deepens. Tonight, someone proposes a topic for discussion: the nature of beauty. Is it inherent in objects, or does it exist only in the eye of the beholder? The debate is spirited. A mathematician argues for objective beauty, pointing to the proportions that please the eye regardless of who observes them. The golden ratio, he says. We find it in shells and flowers, in temples and sculptures. It is beautiful because it is mathematically perfect. A poet disagrees. Beauty is purely subjective, he insists. What delights one person may leave another unmoved. I have seen men weep at songs that bored their companions. I have seen women swoon over paintings that others found ugly. A physician offers a compromise. Perhaps beauty is partly objective and partly subjective. There are proportions that please most observers. We evolved to find certain things attractive, but there is also a personal element, shaped by experience and culture and individual temperament. The debate continues for hours, ranging freely across examples and counterexamples, touching on art and nature and human desire. You contribute your own thoughts, drawing on your reading in Plato. The dialogue shifts and evolves, building on itself like a living thing. At last, the gathering breaks up. The lamps burn low. The servants begin to clear away the dishes. Scholars rise from their benches, stretching, exchanging final thoughts, drifting off toward their chambers. You walk slowly through the gardens, feeling the cool night air on your face. The stars are bright now, scattered across the sky like seeds across a dark field. The Lighthouse of Pharos gleams in the distance, its flame a steady point of light on the harbour. You return to your small chamber, tired but satisfied. Tomorrow you will return to your work on the Phaedo. There are still passages to clarify, variants to resolve, arguments to consider, but for now, you undress and lie down on your narrow bed. The mattress is firm beneath you. The linen sheet is cool against your skin. Through the window, you can see the stars, the same stars that Hipparchus has catalogued, that Aristarchus has studied in his quest to understand the structure of the cosmos. The sounds of the Mouseion settle into silence. The gardens are dark and still. The colonnades are empty. Somewhere, a scribe still works by lamplight, copying texts that will be read by scholars not yet born. Somewhere, a philosopher lies awake, pondering a problem that refuses to resolve, and you drift into sleep. Perhaps you dream of scrolls and arguments, of columns and alcoves, of the endless human effort to understand. Perhaps you dream of nothing at all, your mind resting at last from the day's labor. The library sleeps around you, its scrolls resting on their shelves, its secrets safe for another night. Tomorrow will bring new work, new questions, new discoveries small and large. But tomorrow is not yet here. Rest now. The day is done. The library sleeps, its scrolls waiting for tomorrow's readers. The gardens are dark, the colonnades empty. Only the stars remain awake, wheeling slowly overhead, tracing their ancient paths across the sky. The lighthouse beam sweeps across the dark water. Ships at anchor rise and fall on the gentle swells. Alexandria dreams beneath the stars, dreaming of knowledge and discovery, of scrolls and scholars, and the long slow work of understanding. Those scholars bent over their scrolls. What exactly were they reading? What knowledge was preserved in the library's vast collection? That is the story of our next chapter. Let us speak of the scrolls themselves. We have talked of the scholars who read them, of the buildings that housed them, of the kings who collected them. But what, exactly, did all those hundreds of thousands of scrolls contain? What knowledge was gathered in Alexandria, preserved for future generations, and, in many cases, eventually lost? Imagine walking through the library's alcoves. Each shelf holds a dozen capsae, each capsa a single scroll. The scrolls are arranged by subject, poetry here, history there, philosophy beyond. Within each section, they are ordered alphabetically by author. A small tag hangs from each capsa, identifying its contents. You could wander for hours and barely scratch the surface. You could spend a lifetime reading and never reach the end. At the heart of the collection was Homer. The Iliad and the Odyssey were the foundational texts of Greek culture, the stories that every educated Greek knew by heart, the wellspring from which so much of Greek literature, philosophy, and thought had flowed. No library could claim to be complete without multiple copies of Homer, and Alexandria had far more than just copies. The Iliad tells the story of the Trojan War, or rather, a few weeks near the end of that 10-year conflict. Achilles, the greatest of the Greek warriors, has quarreled with Agamemnon, the commander of the Greek forces. He withdraws from battle, and the war turns against the Greeks. Only when Achilles' beloved companion Patroclus is killed by Hector, Prince of Troy, does Achilles return to fight. His rage is terrible. He slaughters the Trojans by the hundreds. He kills Hector and drags the body behind his chariot around the walls of Troy. And yet the poem ends not with triumph, but with compassion. The old King Priam coming to beg for his son's body, and Achilles, moved by pity, granting the request. The Odyssey is a different kind of story, a journey home. After the fall of Troy, Odysseus wanders the Mediterranean for 10 years, encountering monsters and goddesses, storms and shipwrecks. Meanwhile, his faithful wife Penelope waits on the island of Ithaca, besieged by suitors who want to marry her and claim Odysseus' kingdom. The poem is full of wonders. The one-eyed Cyclops who eats Odysseus' men, the enchantress Circe who turns sailors into swine, the sirens whose songs lure ships onto the rocks, the journey to the underworld where Odysseus speaks with the ghosts of the dead. These poems were the Bible of the ancient Greeks. Children learned them in school. Adults quoted them in conversation. Philosophers debated their meaning. Generals took inspiration from their heroes. and the Library of Alexandria possessed dozens of different versions of the Homeric texts. Some came from Athens, representing the text as it had been recited at the great festivals. Some came from other cities, Argos, Sinope, Marseille, each with its own tradition of transmission. Some were very old, written on papyrus that had begun to crumble with age. Some were recent copies, made from earlier versions that had themselves been copied from still earlier sources. And they did not all agree. One copy might contain lines that another omitted. Certain words differed. Was it the wine-dark sea or the wine-faced sea? Some versions included entire episodes that others lacked. The catalogue of ships in Book 2 of the Iliad, that long list of all the Greek forces who sailed to Troy, varied significantly from copy to copy. This was one of the great challenges of Alexandrian scholarship. Here was Homer, the most revered poet in the Greek world, and yet different copies of his work contained different words, different lines, even different episodes. Which version was correct? Which represented what Homer had actually composed, however many centuries ago? The scholars of Alexandria developed techniques to address this problem. They compared manuscripts systematically, noting where they agreed and where they differed. They considered the style and language of disputed passages, asking whether they matched what Homer wrote elsewhere. They examined the meter, checking whether the verses scanned properly in the ancient rhythms. When they found a line that seemed spurious, perhaps a later addition by some well-meaning editor, they marked it with a symbol in the margin, a horizontal line called an obolos. They did not delete it. That would have been too bold. But they noted their doubts, allowing future scholars to make their own judgments. Out of this work emerged critical editions of Homer, texts that represented the best judgment of Alexandrian scholars about what the original poems had contained. These editions were not perfect. No method can recover with certainty a text that has been copied by hand for generations. But they were far more reliable than anything that had existed before. The Iliad and Odyssey that we read today descend from the Alexandrian editions. When we encounter Homer, we are reading a text shaped by scholars who lived in Alexandria more than 2,000 years ago. Their names are mostly forgotten now. Zenodotus, the first head of the library, who produced the first critical edition. Aristophanes of Byzantium, who introduced the accent marks we still use in Greek. Aristarchus, perhaps the greatest of them all, whose commentaries established the methods of textual criticism still used today. They worked in silence, in the cool alcoves of the library, comparing manuscripts by lamplight, and their work has endured. Beyond Homer, the library contained the full range of Greek literature. There were the tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, whose plays had been performed in the theatres of Athens, and then copied and circulated throughout the Greek world. The library possessed not only the plays we still have today, but dozens of others that have since been lost. Aeschylus was the oldest of the three, a veteran of the Persian Wars who had fought at Marathon. His plays are grand and austere, full of cosmic themes and divine justice. We have 7 of his plays today: the Oresteia trilogy, about the curse on the house of Atreus; Prometheus Bound, about the Titan who stole fire for humanity; the Persians, about the defeat of Xerxes; 7 against Thebes; and the Suppliants. But Aeschylus wrote perhaps 90 plays. The library contained most of them. There were trilogies we can only guess at, plays about Achilles and about Niobe, about the daughters of Danaus and the sons of Egypt. All gone now, preserved only in fragments and titles. Sophocles was the most honored of the tragedians. He won more prizes at the Athenian festivals than any other playwright. His Oedipus the King has been called the perfect tragedy, the story of a man who seeks to escape his fate and thereby fulfills it. We have 7 of his plays: Oedipus, Antigone, Electra, Ajax, Philoctetes, the women of Trachis, and the late Oedipus at Colonus. But Sophocles wrote over 120 plays. The library contained most of them. There were plays about Odysseus and about Hercules, about the judgment of Paris and the fall of Troy. There were satyr plays, bawdy comedic interludes that followed the tragedies. All gone. Euripides was the youngest and most controversial of the three. His plays questioned the gods, gave voice to women and slaves, explored the darkest corners of the human heart. We have 18 of his tragedies: Medea, Hippolytus, the Bacchae, Iphigenia in Aulis, and others, more than we have of Aeschylus and Sophocles combined. This is partly accident. A medieval manuscript containing 10 of Euripides' plays, alphabetically arranged from Epsilon to Kappa, happened to survive when so many others were lost. But we know Euripides wrote about 90 plays. The library contained most of them. What wonders have we lost? What insights into the human condition? We cannot know. The comedies of Aristophanes were there too, full of political satire and bawdy jokes that still make readers laugh today. We have 11 of his plays: the clouds, the wasps, the birds, Lysistrata, the frogs. But he wrote perhaps 40. The library contained them all, and beyond Aristophanes, there were other comic playwrights, Cratinus, Eupolis, Menander, whose works filled many capsi. Menander was especially popular. His comedies of manners and mistaken identity influenced Roman comedy and, through Rome, the entire Western comic tradition. We have one nearly complete play and fragments of others. The library contained over 100. The lyric poets were there as well. Sappho of Lesbos, whom Plato called the 10th Muse. She wrote poems about love and desire, about beauty and loss, about the natural world and the mysteries of the heart. Her verses were famous throughout antiquity, tender, passionate, exquisitely crafted. We have perhaps one complete poem of Sappho's, and fragments of others, lines that have survived by accident, quoted by later writers, discovered on scraps of papyrus in Egyptian rubbish heaps. The library contained 9 books of her poetry, arranged by meter. All gone. Pindar, the greatest of the choral lyricists, whose victory odes celebrated the winners at the Olympic Games and other festivals. His language is dense and elusive, packed with myth and metaphor. We have 4 books of his victory odes. He wrote 17 books of poetry in various forms. The library contained them all: Alcaeus and Alcman, Anacreon and Bacchylides, names that were famous in antiquity, poets whose verses were sung at symposia and festivals. We have fragments. The library had their complete works. There was history. Herodotus, the father of history, who had travelled throughout the known world gathering stories of peoples and customs and wars. His histories cover the Persian Wars and much else besides, the origins of the conflict between Greece and Persia, the customs of the Egyptians and Scythians and Babylonians, digressions into geography and ethnography and natural history. Herodotus survives complete. We are lucky. Thucydides, whose account of the Peloponnesian War remains a model of historical writing. His analysis is sharp, his prose austere, his judgments unsentimental. He sought to record events as they actually happened, stripping away myth and rumor, trusting only what could be verified. Thucydides survives, though his history breaks off abruptly. He died before completing his account of the war. What he might have written, we cannot know. Xenophon, who had marched with 10,000 Greek mercenaries through the heart of the Persian Empire and lived to tell the tale. His Anabasis, the march-up country, describes how these soldiers, hired by a Persian prince to seize the throne, fought their way home after their employer was killed and they were stranded deep in hostile territory. Xenophon survives almost complete. We are lucky again. But there were so many historians who did not survive. Ephorus, who wrote a universal history of the Greek world from the return of the Heraclidae to his own time, 30 books, covering centuries. Lost, except for fragments quoted by later writers. Theopompus, whose histories of Philip of Macedon and the Greek world filled dozens of scrolls. Lost. Timaeus, who wrote the history of Sicily and the Western Mediterranean. Lost, except for fragments. The library contained them all. Scholars in Alexandria could read continuous narratives of events that we must piece together from scattered references. The philosophers were well represented. Plato's dialogues, preserved in careful editions, the Republic, the Symposium, the Phaedo, the Timaeus, and dozens of others. Plato survives complete. We are fortunate. The treatises of Aristotle, on subjects ranging from physics to politics to the proper structure of a tragic play. The Nicomachean Ethics, on the nature of the good life. The Politics, on the best forms of government. The Poetics, on the art of drama. The Logical Works, establishing the foundations of Western thought. Aristotle survives, though not complete. We have his lecture notes, his technical treatises. But his published dialogues, works that were famous in antiquity for their elegant prose, are lost. We know only their titles. Beyond Plato and Aristotle, there were the other schools. The Stoics taught that virtue is the only true good, that we should accept what fate brings with equanimity, that the wise person lives in harmony with nature and reason. Their founder, Zeno of Citium, wrote extensively. The library contained his works. All lost. The Epicureans taught that pleasure is the highest good, not crude sensual pleasure, but the refined pleasure of a life free from fear and pain. Epicurus himself wrote 300 books. The library contained many of them. Almost all lost. The skeptics questioned whether knowledge was possible at all. The cynics rejected conventional values in favor of a simple life according to nature. Each school produced its literature. The library preserved it. Most is gone. And then there were the sciences. The library contained mathematical works that trace the development of Greek geometry from its earliest beginnings through the sophisticated proofs of Euclid and Archimedes. Euclid's Element survives, that systematic presentation of geometry that remained the standard textbook for over 2,000 years. Every theorem proved from first principles. Every definition precise and clear, a monument of logical thought. Archimedes' works survive in part. His treatise on the measurement of the circle, where he calculated pi with remarkable accuracy. His work on floating bodies, which established the principles of buoyancy. His study of spirals and conoids, pushing the boundaries of geometric understanding. But Archimedes wrote more than survives. His method, a work describing how he discovered his theorems before proving them rigorously, was lost for centuries, rediscovered only in the 20th century on a palimpsest, where monks had scraped away the mathematics to write prayers over it. The library held astronomical observations going back centuries, records of eclipses and planetary movements that allowed scholars to test their theories against data. Hipparchus compiled a star catalogue, the positions and brightnesses of over 800 stars, carefully measured and recorded. This catalogue was the foundation of all later astronomical work. It is lost. We know of it only through Ptolemy, who used it centuries later for his own astronomical system. Aristarchus proposed that the Earth goes around the Sun, a heliocentric theory that would not be accepted until Copernicus, nearly 2,000 years later. His book on the subject was in the library. Lost, except for references by other writers. There were medical texts, the writings attributed to Hippocrates, the father of medicine, along with treatises by later physicians who had studied at Alexandria itself. Herophilus and Erasistratus practiced dissection in Alexandria, opening human bodies to understand their structure. They described the brain and the nervous system, the heart and the blood vessels, the organs of digestion and reproduction. Their works were in the library, or lost. For a brief time in Alexandria, human anatomy was actually studied through direct observation. Then this knowledge was forgotten, not to be recovered until the Renaissance, when Vesalius began dissecting bodies again. The library held works on geography, descriptions of the known world, from the Atlantic Ocean to India, from the frozen north to the deserts of Africa. Eratosthenes, who was head of the library, wrote a systematic geography that divided the world into zones and regions. He calculated the circumference of the earth with remarkable accuracy, within a few % of the true value, by measuring the angle of the sun's rays at different latitudes. His geography was in the library, lost, except for quotations. There were books on music, explaining the mathematical relationships between different notes and the proper modes for different occasions. Aristophanes wrote extensively on musical theory. Lost. Books on rhetoric, teaching the art of persuasive speech. The handbooks of Aristotle and Theophrastus, partially lost. Books on grammar, analyzing the structure of the Greek language. The systematic studies of Dionysius Thrax and Apollonius Discalus. These survive, foundations of the grammatical tradition that continues today. And there were books in other languages, translated into Greek so that Alexandrian scholars could access their wisdom. The Jewish scriptures, rendered into Greek as the Septuagint. We have spoken of this translation. The 72 scholars on the island of Pharos, working for 72 days to produce a Greek Torah. Whether the legend is true or not, the Septuagint was made in Alexandria, and it opened Jewish wisdom to the Greek world. Egyptian religious texts and historical records, translated for Greek readers curious about the ancient civilization that surrounded them. Manetho, an Egyptian priest, wrote a history of Egypt in Greek, dividing the pharaohs into the 30 dynasties we still use today. His work survives only in fragments, but it was complete in the library. Persian books on astronomy and astrology, preserving knowledge that the Persians had themselves inherited from even older Babylonian sources. Indian philosophy, brought back by travelers who had journeyed to the subcontinent. The library aspired to contain all human knowledge, regardless of its origin. If wisdom existed anywhere in the world, the Ptolemies wanted a copy of it in Alexandria. How many scrolls did the library ultimately contain? Ancient sources give varying numbers. Some speak of 400,000 scrolls. Others claim 700,000. The largest estimates approach 1 million. These numbers are difficult to evaluate. Ancient writers were prone to exaggeration, and we cannot be sure what they were counting. A scroll could mean different things. A long work like the Iliad might be divided across many scrolls. A short poem might share a scroll with other works. Were the numbers counting individual scrolls, or the works they contained? Were duplicate copies included, or only unique texts? Perhaps the numbers do not matter. What matters is this: the Library of Alexandria was far larger than any collection that had existed before. It represented a quantum leap in the scale of human knowledge gathering. In its alcoves and reading rooms, scholars could access texts that existed nowhere else. They could compare versions and editions, trace the development of ideas, see how one thinker had responded to another. They could spend lifetimes learning and never reach the end. And yet, and this is the melancholy truth, most of it is gone. The great majority of Greek literature has been lost. We have perhaps 10% of what ancient writers produced, maybe less. Entire genres have vanished. Entire fields of knowledge have disappeared. The plays we will never see performed. The histories we will never read. the scientific works that would take centuries to rediscover, the poetry that moved ancient audiences to tears, silenced forever. What happened to all those scrolls? That is a story we will come to in due course. The fires and the neglect, the changing religions and the barbarian invasions that slowly, over centuries, reduced the library to memory. But for now, let us remember what once existed. Let us imagine the shelves filled with scrolls, the alcoves crowded with readers, the accumulated wisdom of the ancient world gathered in one place. It was a treasure house. For 3 centuries, it held the collected knowledge of humanity. Rest now. The scrolls will keep their secrets. The library was not alone in declaring Alexandria's glory. At the harbor's edge stood another wonder, a tower of light visible for miles across the dark Mediterranean. In our next chapter, we shall visit the Lighthouse of Pharos. Let us turn our gaze from the library's scrolls to the harbor of Alexandria, where another wonder rose against the sky, the Lighthouse of Pharos. One of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, a tower of light that guided sailors home across the dark Mediterranean for more than 1,000 years. Close your eyes and imagine the harbor of Alexandria as the sun begins to set. The great ships ride at anchor, their masts swaying gently with the swells. Sailors coil ropes, merchants tally their cargoes, fishermen haul in their nets. And there, at the end of the long causeway, the lighthouse rises into the evening sky. It catches the last rays of the setting sun, its white stone glowing golden, then pink, then deep purple as twilight settles over the sea. And as darkness falls, the keepers climb the long stairs to light the flame that will burn until dawn. The lighthouse stood on the island of Pharos, just off the coast of Alexandria. This was the same island that Alexander had noticed when he chose the site for his city, a natural breakwater that created 2 sheltered harbors, one facing east and one facing west. Pharos was small, perhaps half a mile long, but its position made it invaluable. Ships approaching from the west could anchor in the great harbor, sheltered from the prevailing winds. Ships from the east could use the harbor of Good Return. The island protected both. A causeway called the Heptastadion, the 7 stadia, connected Pharos to the mainland. 7 stadia is roughly 3/4 of a mile, though the measurement may not have been exact. This massive structure, built of stone and fill, allowed goods and people to move between the city and the island. Workers labored for years on the Heptastadion, dumping load after load of rubble and stone into the shallow waters. The causeway rose gradually, a man-made bridge connecting Alexandria to its guardian island. Over time, silt accumulated on either side. Sand and sediment built up against the causeway walls. What had been open water slowly became land. Eventually, the Heptastadion became an isthmus, and Pharos became a peninsula, permanently joined to the mainland. The lighthouse itself was built during the reign of Ptolemy II Philadelphus, the same king who had expanded the library so dramatically. Construction began around 292 before the Common Era and took about 12 years to complete. The finished structure was dedicated around 280 BCE. Imagine the construction site. Hundreds of workers, stonemasons and carpenters, engineers and laborers swarming over the island. Ships arriving daily with stone from quarries up the coast, block after massive block hauled into place, fitted with precision, mortared with lime and sand. The architect was a man named Sostratus of Cnidus, from a Greek city on the coast of Asia Minor. He was one of the great engineers of his age, known for designing temples and harbors throughout the Ptolemaic realm. According to legend, Ptolemy forbade Sostratus from putting his own name on the lighthouse. Such monuments were supposed to honor kings, not architects. The building was a gift from the king to the people, or rather, a demonstration of the king's power and generosity. But Sostratus was clever. He carved his own name deep into the stone of the lighthouse's foundation. Sostratus, son of Dexophanes of Cnidus, on behalf of all those who sail the seas, to the saviour gods. Then he covered his inscription with a layer of plaster. On the plaster, he carved a dedication to Ptolemy Philadelphus, as the king had commanded. Sostratus knew that plaster does not last. In time, perhaps a century, perhaps two, the plaster would crumble and fall away. And then his true inscription would be revealed. That is exactly what happened. Centuries after Sostratus and Ptolemy were both long dead, the plaster crumbled. And there, carved into the stone for all to see, was Sostratus's name. The architect had outlasted the king. What did the lighthouse look like? No detailed description survives from antiquity. The writers who mentioned it assumed their readers had seen it, or at least seen images of it. They did not need to explain what was common knowledge, but we can piece together a picture from scattered references, from later accounts, from images on coins and mosaics. The structure rose in 3 sections, each smaller than the one below. The lowest section was square, built of massive stone blocks, white limestone faced with granite or marble. This was the foundation, solid and unshakable, designed to resist the winds and waves that battered the exposed island. The base was broad, perhaps 200 feet on each side, and rose perhaps 200 feet into the air. Within it were chambers and storerooms, housing for the lighthouse keepers, storage for the fuel that fed the flame. A gentle ramp spiraled up the exterior of this lowest section, wide enough for donkeys to carry loads of wood and oil to the upper levels. The keepers made this journey many times each day, hauling the fuel that kept the light burning. At the corners of the square base stood statues of Tritons, half men, half fish, the messengers of the sea god Poseidon. They blew conch shells, their cheeks puffed, announcing to approaching sailors that they had reached Alexandria. Above this square base rose an octagonal section, tapering slightly as it climbed. This middle portion was perhaps 100 feet tall, narrower than the base, but still substantial. The octagon contained the interior chambers and stairways that allowed keepers to ascend to the top. The stairs wound upward in a spiral, lit by small windows that offered glimpses of the harbour, the city, the endless sea. The highest section was cylindrical, rising another 50 feet or more. It was crowned with a statue, probably of Zeus Soter, the saviour, patron of sailors and travellers. Some accounts say there was a statue of Poseidon instead, or perhaps both gods were represented. At the very top, just below the statue, was the lantern room. And within the lantern room burned the fire that gave the lighthouse its purpose. How tall was the complete structure? Ancient sources give various figures, but most estimates place the lighthouse between 300 and 400 feet in height, roughly the size of a modern 40-story building, roughly a third the height of the Eiffel Tower. Until the construction of medieval cathedrals, it was one of the tallest structures ever built by human hands. The light itself came from a great fire, burning wood and oil, tended through the night by the lighthouse keepers. These men, and they were always men, in the ancient world, lived on Pharos, their lives devoted to a single purpose: keeping the flame alive. They worked in shifts, one team resting while another watched the fire. They hauled fuel up the long ramps, fed logs into the flames, trimmed wicks, removed ashes. Their work was endless and essential. If the fire went out, ships would be lost. But fire alone, even a large fire, would not be visible far out to sea. On a dark night, a bonfire might be seen from a few miles away, not nearly far enough for sailors crossing the Mediterranean. The Alexandrians solved this problem with mirrors. Behind the fire, arranged in careful curves, were sheets of polished bronze. These mirrors gathered the light from the flames and focused it, reflecting it outward in a concentrated beam. The technology was similar to the curved mirrors we use today in flashlights and spotlights, simple in principle, but requiring precise engineering to execute. The mirrors were massive, perhaps 12 feet or more in diameter. They were polished until they gleamed, maintained by keepers who rubbed them with oil and sand to preserve their reflective surface. With these mirrors, the light from a wood fire could be seen from 30 miles away, perhaps more on a clear night. A ship sailing from Greece or Rome or Carthage could see the lighthouse long before the Egyptian coast came into view. Some ancient writers claimed the mirrors could be used to focus sunlight during the day, burning enemy ships that approached the harbor. This is probably exaggeration. The technology to create such powerful solar weapons did not exist in the ancient world. But the story speaks to the awe the lighthouse inspired. Let us imagine the experience of a sailor approaching Alexandria by night. You have been at sea for weeks, sailing from Athens or perhaps from Rome. Your ship is a merchant vessel, carrying wine and olive oil to trade for Egyptian grain. The crossing has been difficult. Storms off the coast of Crete, calms in the middle waters, the constant anxiety of traveling beyond sight of land. You have been navigating by the stars, by the sun, by your knowledge of winds and currents. You have counted the days and estimated your speed. You believe you are close to Egypt, but you cannot be certain. The sea offers no landmarks, no signposts. Every direction looks the same. And then, in the deep of the night, one of your sailors calls out. He points toward the southern horizon. You look and see nothing at first. But then, yes, there it is. Point of light. Too steady to be a star. Too bright to be anything else. It does not flicker like a star, does not rise or set. It simply hangs there, at the edge of the world, a fixed point in the darkness. A lighthouse. A wave of relief washes over you. You are not lost. You have not drifted off course. Alexandria lies ahead, exactly where your charts said it would be. The voyage is almost over. You adjust your heading slightly, steering toward that distant glow. The night passes slowly, but you do not mind. The anxiety of the open sea is behind you. Safety lies ahead. As the hours pass, the light grows brighter. The tower takes shape, first a vague column against the stars, then a distinct structure with visible details. You can make out the three sections now: the broad base, the octagonal middle, the cylindrical top with its crown of flame. Other ships are visible, their own lamps tiny sparks in the darkness. They are all converging on that single point, all drawn by the same light. By the time dawn breaks, you can see the harbour opening before you. Ships of every size ride at anchor, war galleys and merchant vessels, fishing boats and royal yachts. The city spreads along the shore, white and gleaming in the morning light, and there, at the harbour's edge, the lighthouse stands like a giant keeping watch. In daylight, you can see the details: the ramps spiralling up the base, the windows dotting the octagon, the statue at the very top, one hand raised in greeting or blessing. You have arrived. You have crossed the sea and reached Alexandria, greatest of cities, and the lighthouse guided you home. The lighthouse keepers lived lives of quiet dedication. They were neither rich nor famous, but their work was essential. Without them, the flame would die. Without the flame, ships would be lost. They lived on Pharos, in chambers within the lighthouse's base. Their days followed a rhythm as regular as the tides. Wake before dawn to check the fire. Haul fuel up the ramps. Polish the mirrors. Trim the wicks. Watch for storms that might threaten the flame. At night, they worked in shifts, 2 or 3 men always awake, always watching. The fire must not go out. Not for storms, not for sickness, not for anything. Ships were depending on them, sailors who trusted that the light would be there. The keepers passed their knowledge from generation to generation. Fathers taught sons. Masters trained apprentices. The skills of lighthouse keeping, how to read the weather, how to maintain the mirrors, how to coax a dying fire back to life. These were precious secrets, guarded and preserved. The lighthouse was more than a practical structure. It was a symbol of Alexandria itself, a beacon declaring the city's wealth, its power, its mastery over nature. The library was a beacon too, in its way, a beacon of knowledge, drawing scholars from across the Greek world. The lighthouse drew ships. The library drew minds. Together, they made Alexandria the center of the Mediterranean world. The lighthouse was maintained throughout the Ptolemaic period and long into the Roman era. Emperors came and went. Dynasties rose and fell. The ancient religion gave way to Christianity, then to Islam. But the lighthouse endured. When Arab armies conquered Egypt in the 7th century of the Common Era, the lighthouse still stood, still functioned, still guided ships into the harbor. The new rulers recognized its value and maintained it, just as the Ptolemies and the Romans had before them. But even the lighthouse could not last forever. The exposed position on Pharos made it vulnerable to the sea. Waves battered its foundation, salt air corroded its stone, and the region was prone to earthquakes. The first serious damage came in the 8th century, when an earthquake toppled the uppermost section. The cylindrical lantern room fell, taking the great statue with it. The keepers rebuilt what they could, but the lighthouse was never quite the same. More earthquakes followed. The great earthquake of 956 did significant harm, cracking walls, toppling columns. Repairs were made, but each earthquake left the structure weaker than before. The final blow came in 1303, when a massive earthquake struck the eastern Mediterranean. The lighthouse, already weakened by centuries of damage, could not withstand the shock. Most of what remained collapsed, tumbling into the sea. By the 15th century, only ruins were left. The great tower that had guided sailors for 1,000 years was gone, but the site remained strategic. In 1480, the Sultan of Egypt ordered a fortress built on the same spot, using the stones of the fallen lighthouse as building material. The Cape Bay citadel still stands today, a medieval fortress constructed from ancient rubble. In the 1990s, underwater archaeologists began exploring the waters around Pharos. What they found exceeded their expectations. Massive stone blocks, some weighing over 50 tons, lay scattered on the seafloor. Pieces of statuary, a colossal arm, fragments of faces, the torso of a woman who might have been Isis. Fragments of the mirrors that once gathered the light, bronze corroded green by centuries in the salt water. These relics offer tantalizing glimpses of the wonder that once stood above the waves. They confirm what the ancient sources told us, that the lighthouse was truly colossal, truly magnificent, truly one of the wonders of the world. But they cannot bring it back. The lighthouse exists now only in history and imagination. For our story, the lighthouse matters most as context, as part of the world in which the library existed. When scholars arrived in Alexandria by sea, they would have seen the lighthouse first. It would have been their guide and their greeting, the first sign that they had reached their destination. As they sailed into the harbor, its white stone would have towered above them, a giant welcome home. And as they walked the streets of the city, pursued their research in the library, debated in the gardens of the Mouseion, the lighthouse would have been a constant presence. From the windows of the reading rooms, they could see it rising above the harbor. At night, its flame flickered against the stars. The scholars would have taken it for granted, perhaps. It was simply part of the landscape, part of what made Alexandria Alexandria. But to visitors from other cities, The lighthouse was a marvel, proof that this city was unlike any other. The library and the lighthouse were twin symbols of Alexandrian greatness. One gathered knowledge, the other spread light. One preserved the wisdom of the past, the other guided travelers through the darkness of the present. Both were built by the Ptolemies, those ambitious kings who dreamed of making Alexandria the center of the world. Both were maintained for centuries, through war and peace, through prosperity and decline. Both became legends, spoken of with wonder long after they had passed. For 3 centuries, both lights burned bright. And then the shadows began to gather. Rest now. The lighthouse will continue its watch. Its beam sweeps across the dark water, bringing hope to sailors far from home. The waves lap softly against the stone foundation. The keepers climb their endless stairs, carrying fuel to feed the flame. In the library, the lamps burn low as scholars work through the night. Alexandria sleeps beneath the stars, dreaming of knowledge and light. In our next chapter, we shall speak of Cleopatra and Caesar, of fire and war, of the turning point when the library's long decline began. The year is 48 before the Common Era. 3 centuries have passed since Alexander founded his city. The Ptolemaic dynasty has ruled Egypt for generation after generation. 13 rulers bearing the name Ptolemy, queens named Cleopatra and Berenice and Arsinoe. The library has grown into the greatest repository of knowledge the world has ever seen. But the world is changing. Far to the west, a city has risen that Alexander never knew. Rome, once a cluster of villages on the Tiber River, has grown into a power that dominates the Mediterranean. Its legions have conquered Greece and Carthage, Spain and Gaul. The old Greek kingdoms that emerged from Alexander's empire are falling, one by one, under Roman control. Macedonia has fallen. Syria has fallen. Pergamon has fallen. Only Egypt remains independent, wealthy, ancient, the last of the great Hellenistic kingdoms. And now Rome's attention turns to the Nile. Egypt in this era was a prize beyond measure. Its grain fed the Roman masses. Every year, fleets of cargo ships carried Egyptian wheat across the Mediterranean to feed the hungry millions of Rome. Whoever controlled Egypt controlled whether Rome ate or starved. Its wealth filled the treasuries of whoever ruled it. The Ptolemies had taxed every aspect of Egyptian life, the harvest, the trade, the very papyrus reeds that grew along the Nile. Gold flowed into Alexandria like water flows downhill. Its strategic position controlled trade routes that spanned continents. Ships from India and Arabia brought spices and silks through Egyptian ports. The overland trade routes that connected Africa to Asia passed through Egyptian territory. Whoever ruled Egypt sat at the crossroads of the world. And Egypt, in 48 BCE, was in chaos. The reigning monarch was Cleopatra VII, the Cleopatra, the one remembered by history. She was 21 years old, brilliant, ambitious, and fighting for her throne. Let us speak of her for a moment. Cleopatra was not Egyptian by blood. She was Greek, a descendant of Ptolemy I, Alexander's general who had seized Egypt 3 centuries before. The Ptolemies had intermarried with other Greeks, occasionally with the royal houses of Macedonia and Syria, but never with native Egyptians. After 3 centuries of Ptolemaic rule, the royal family had adopted many Egyptian customs. They built temples in the Egyptian style. They patronized the Egyptian priesthood. They styled themselves as pharaohs, heirs to the ancient tradition of divine kingship. But they remained fundamentally Greek in culture and language. The court spoke Greek. The administration was conducted in Greek. The royal family married within itself. Brothers wed sisters, as the pharaohs had done. But they never forgot that they were Greeks ruling a foreign land. Cleopatra was exceptional among her line. She was the first Ptolemy in generations to learn the Egyptian language, to speak directly with her native subjects rather than relying on interpreters. She also spoke Greek, of course, and reportedly knew Hebrew, Aramaic, and several other tongues. Ancient writers claimed she could converse with visitors from any nation in their own language. She was educated in the library's traditions. The Mouseion was part of the palace complex. Cleopatra would have grown up surrounded by scholars and scholarship. She was familiar with philosophy and literature, with science and mathematics. She could discuss Plato with philosophers and astronomy with astronomers. And she was politically astute beyond her years. She had watched her father, Ptolemy I, struggle to hold his throne against rivals and Roman pressure. She had seen the intrigues of the Alexandrian court, the dangers of royal life. She knew that survival required cunning, that power went to those willing to reach for it. But for all her brilliance, Cleopatra's position was precarious. The Ptolemaic succession had never been simple. Brothers competed with brothers. Queens plotted against kings. Eunuchs and courtiers manipulated their masters. Cleopatra's own father had been driven from his throne by his own children, forced to buy his way back with Roman gold and Roman soldiers. Now Cleopatra faced her own struggle. According to Ptolemaic custom, she had been forced to share the throne with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. He was 10 years old when they became co-rulers, a boy controlled by his advisors. The two siblings despised each other, or rather, those who controlled them despised each other. The court split into factions. The eunuch Pothinus, the general Achilles, the tutor Theodosius. These men controlled young Ptolemy and resented Cleopatra's independence. They schemed to remove her from power entirely. And they succeeded. For a time, Cleopatra was driven from Alexandria, forced to flee into the desert, where she raised an army of mercenaries and Arab allies. Her brother controlled the capital, while she gathered her forces in the wastes beyond. Into this turbulent situation came Julius Caesar. Caesar was 52 years old, a veteran of decades of war and politics, the conqueror of Gaul, the man who had crossed the Rubicon and sparked a civil war that would reshape the Roman world. He was pursuing his rival Pompey, who had fled east after losing the decisive battle at Pharsalus in Greece. Pompey had been the greatest general of his generation, the conqueror of the East, the man who had once seemed invincible. Now he was a fugitive, running for his life, hoping to find refuge in Egypt. Why Egypt? Because Pompey had once helped restore Cleopatra's father to his throne. Because the Ptolemies owed him favors. Because Egypt was wealthy and might provide the resources for another round of fighting. But Pompey miscalculated. The advisors of young Ptolemy XIII saw an opportunity. If they sheltered Pompey, they would earn Caesar's enmity. If they handed him over, they might earn Caesar's gratitude. They chose the simpler path. When Pompey arrived at Alexandria, he was invited to come ashore. He climbed into a small boat, rowed by men he believed were friends, and there, in sight of his wife and son waiting on his ship, Pompey was stabbed in the back. His body was left on the beach. His head was preserved in salt. Caesar arrived a few days later. He sailed into the harbour of Alexandria with a small force, perhaps 3,000 legionaries, far too few to conquer Egypt, but enough to make his presence felt. He expected to find Pompey. He expected to negotiate, perhaps to pardon his old rival and end the civil war. Instead, Ptolemy's advisors presented him with Pompey's severed head. The sources say Caesar wept, whether for Pompey, for the loss of a worthy adversary, for the cruelty of fate, we cannot know. But he was also furious. Pompey had been a Roman consul, a great general, a man of dignity. To see him murdered by foreigners, butchered like a criminal, It was an insult to Rome itself, and it changed Caesar's plans. Instead of leaving Alexandria quickly, Caesar lingered. He established himself in the royal palace, the same palace that housed the Mouseion and the library. He demanded payment of old debts that the Ptolemies owed to Rome. He began to meddle in Egyptian politics, and he met Cleopatra. The story of how Cleopatra met Caesar has become legendary. She was still in the desert, technically in exile, unable to enter Alexandria openly. Her brother's forces controlled the city. Guards watched the gates. Anyone who tried to bring her message to Caesar would be intercepted. But Cleopatra was resourceful. According to tradition, she had herself smuggled into the palace. Some accounts say she was rolled up in a carpet. Others say it was a linen sack or a bedroll. Whatever the container, a servant carried it through the palace gates, past the guards, into the presence of Julius Caesar. When the covering was unrolled, Cleopatra emerged, young, brilliant, audacious beyond measure. Imagine the scene. Caesar, the most powerful man in the Roman world, sits in a borrowed palace far from home. He is tired from the civil war, grieving perhaps for Pompey, uncertain of his next move. The door opens. A servant enters carrying a rolled bundle. And out of that bundle steps a queen. She would have been dressed carefully, Egyptian royal regalia, perhaps, or Greek finery. She would have prepared her arguments, marshalled her charm, calculated every word. This was the gamble of her life. If she could win Caesar's support, she would regain her throne. If she failed, she would likely die. Caesar was captivated. Here was a woman unlike any he had known, royal yet resourceful, learned yet passionate, willing to risk everything for her crown. She could discuss philosophy and history. She was familiar with the world Caesar inhabited, and she was young, beautiful in the particular way of Greek queens, with the confidence of someone born to rule. They talked through the night, these two extraordinary people. By morning, they were allies, and some sources say they were more than allies. What followed was a complex dance of politics and passion. Caesar declared that he would settle the dispute between Cleopatra and her brother. He summoned young Ptolemy to the palace. The boy came, saw his sister already there, already allied with the Roman general, and flew into a rage. He tore the diadem from his head and stormed out, crying that he had been betrayed. The die was cast. War had come to Alexandria. Caesar took Cleopatra's side in the civil war against her brother. Roman legions and Egyptian forces clashed in the streets of Alexandria. The city that had known peace for centuries became a battleground. The fighting was desperate. Caesar had too few troops to hold the entire city. He fortified the palace quarter and waited for reinforcements. Egyptian forces surrounded him, cutting off his supplies. The fate of the greatest general in the world hung in the balance. And somewhere in this chaos, fire came to Alexandria. The sources disagree about exactly what happened. Most accounts say that Caesar, trapped in the harbor, ordered ships to be set alight to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. The Egyptian fleet outnumbered his. If they captured his ships, he would have no escape. The fire spread from the ships to the docks, from the docks to the warehouses that lined the waterfront. Flames leaped from building to building, driven by the Mediterranean winds. The night sky glowed orange over Alexandria. Did the fire reach the library? This is where history becomes murky. Some ancient writers claim that the fire destroyed the library entirely, that the accumulated wisdom of centuries was consumed in a single night. Seneca wrote that 400,000 scrolls were lost. Other accounts agree that the loss was catastrophic, but other sources tell a different story. They say that it was not the library itself that burned, but a warehouse storing scrolls that were awaiting export. These scrolls had been copied for sale to other cities. They were stacked near the harbor, ready for shipping. When the fire spread from the docks, they went up in flames. Still other writers make no mention of any damage to the library at all. They describe Caesar's war in detail, but say nothing about burning books. What we can say is this: something was lost in 48 BCE. Some portion of Alexandria's collection went up in flames during Caesar's war. Whether it was the main library in the Mouseion, a branch library at the Serapeum, or simply a warehouse of copies awaiting export, we cannot be certain. But the fire marked a wound that the city's learning would never fully heal. The war continued for months. Reinforcements arrived from Syria and Asia Minor. Caesar broke out of the palace quarter and took the offensive. There were battles on land and sea, victories and defeats, moments when it seemed Caesar might fall. But in the end, the Romans prevailed. Ptolemy XIII, the boy king, was killed, drowned in the Nile while trying to escape a lost battle. His golden armor dragged him down into the mud. They never found his body. Cleopatra became sole ruler of Egypt, with Caesar's legions to enforce her claim. She was 22 years old. She had gambled everything: her throne, her life, her kingdom's future, and she had won. Egypt was hers. Caesar himself lingered in Alexandria for months after the war ended. He could have left immediately. Rome needed him. The civil war was not yet entirely won, but he stayed, touring the wonders of the city, the lighthouse, the palace, the tomb of Alexander that still held the conqueror's body. And presumably he visited the library. Perhaps he saw the damage his war had caused. Perhaps he walked through the reading rooms, examined the scrolls, talked with the scholars who remained. He was a man of letters himself, an author of histories and memoirs. The library would have fascinated him. He and Cleopatra became lovers. This is certain. They produced a son together, a boy Cleopatra named Ptolemy Caesar, but whom history knows as Caesarion, Little Caesar. The child was born after Caesar left Egypt, but there is no doubt of his parentage. The relationship between Caesar and Cleopatra was political as well as personal. Egypt was the wealthiest kingdom in the Mediterranean. Rome was the most powerful. Together, they could dominate the world. But their time together was brief. Caesar returned to Rome in 47 BCE. He still had wars to fight, rivals to defeat, a republic to reshape. Cleopatra followed him later, establishing herself in a villa across the Tiber, scandalizing Roman society. She was still there when, on the Ides of March in 44 BCE, Caesar was assassinated by senators who feared his power. Cleopatra fled back to Egypt, carrying her son, leaving behind a world in chaos. Years passed. Rome tore itself apart in civil wars, Caesar's assassins against his heirs against each other. The old republic died in blood and fire, giving way to something new. And in 41 BCE, Mark Antony came to Egypt. Antony was one of the three men who now ruled Rome, a triumvir, alongside Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, and Lepidus. He had been Caesar's right hand, his most trusted general. Now he controlled the eastern Mediterranean, and he needed Egyptian wealth to fund his wars. He summoned Cleopatra to meet him at Tarsus, in what is now Turkey. She came, but not as a supplicant. Her barge sailed up the river, gilded and gleaming, with silver oars and purple sails. Cleopatra reclined beneath a canopy of gold cloth, dressed as Venus, the goddess of love. Slave girls fanned her. Boys dressed as Cupids attended her. The scent of perfume spread across the water. Antony, waiting on the shore, found himself summoned to her barge. The conqueror was conquered. Their alliance lasted more than a decade. Antony and Cleopatra became lovers, partners. co-rulers of an Eastern empire that stretched from Greece to Egypt. They had 3 children together. Antony gave Cleopatra territories that had been Roman: Cyprus, parts of Syria, the coast of Judea. And according to one ancient source, he gave her 200,000 scrolls from the Library of Pergamon. Pergamon's library had long competed with Alexandria for intellectual prestige. The kings of Pergamon had gathered their own collection, rivaling the Ptolemy scroll for scroll. When Egypt restricted papyrus exports to hamper their rival, Pergamon invented parchment as a substitute. If Antony truly gave Pergamon's collection to Cleopatra, it would have been an extraordinary gift: 200,000 scrolls to replace what had been lost in Caesar's fire. Many of the same works, many copied from the same originals. A second chance for Alexandria, but even 200,000 scrolls could not restore what had burned. Some texts had existed only in Alexandria. When the flames took them, they were gone forever. The alliance of Antony and Cleopatra could not last. Rome would not accept being ruled, even in part, from Alexandria. Octavian, young, cold, patient, worked to turn Roman opinion against his rival. Antony was called a traitor, a man bewitched by a foreign queen, a Roman who had forgotten what it meant to be Roman. In 31 BCE, the final confrontation came. The 2 fleets met at Actium, off the coast of Greece. Octavian's ships were smaller but more maneuverable. Antony's were larger but harder to handle. The battle was confused, uncertain, fought in smoke and spray, and then Cleopatra fled. Her ships broke through the battle line and sailed south, toward Egypt. Antony, seeing her go, abandoned his fleet and followed. Perhaps he feared for her safety. Perhaps he knew the battle was lost. Perhaps love conquered duty. Whatever his reasons, his flight doomed his cause. His troops surrendered or switched sides. Octavian was master of the Roman world. A year later, both Antony and Cleopatra were dead. Antony fell on his sword when he heard false reports that Cleopatra had died. Mortally wounded, he was carried to her, dying in her arms. Cleopatra herself died soon after, by the bite of an asp, according to legend, though we cannot be certain. She was 39 years old, and she had been queen for 21 years. With Cleopatra's death, the Ptolemaic dynasty came to an end. 3 centuries of rule, from Ptolemy I to Cleopatra VII. 13 kings named Ptolemy, the library built and expanded, the lighthouse rising against the sky. All of it ending in a room in Alexandria, with a woman dead and a conqueror at the gates. Egypt became a Roman province. Octavian, soon to be called Augustus, the first emperor, kept Egypt for himself. It was too rich, too important to be entrusted to any senator. Roman governors ruled in the pharaoh's palace. Roman soldiers patrolled the streets. The grain of Egypt fed Rome, and Rome controlled Egypt. Alexandria remained a great city, perhaps the second greatest in the Roman Empire, after Rome itself. Its harbor was still busy. Its craftsmen still produced fine goods. Its scholars still studied, but it was no longer the capital of an independent kingdom. It was a provincial city, ruled from afar by distant masters. The Ptolemies were gone. The library continued, but something had changed. The golden age was over. The long twilight was beginning. Rest now. The flames have died. The streets of Alexandria are quiet again. The palace quarter still stands. The library still holds its scrolls. Scholars still work by lamplight, still copy texts, still debate in the gardens. The lighthouse still guides ships into the harbor. But the queen is dead. The kingdom has fallen. Egypt belongs to Rome now. In our next chapter, we shall follow the library through its long twilight, the centuries of slow decline, the changing religions, the final destruction. The centuries that followed Cleopatra were centuries of slow decline. Not sudden catastrophe, not a single dramatic destruction, rather, a gradual fading, like a lamp whose oil slowly runs out, its flame growing dimmer year by year until at last it gutters and dies. The library did not end with a fire or a conquering army. It ended with neglect, with forgetting, with the slow erosion of what had taken centuries to build. Under Roman rule, Alexandria remained a great city. Its population swelled to perhaps 500,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the ancient world. Only Rome itself was larger. The streets were crowded with people of every nation, Greeks and Egyptians, Jews and Syrians, traders from India and sailors from Spain. The harbour remained one of the busiest in the Mediterranean. Ships came and went as they always had, carrying grain to Rome, bringing goods from the east. The lighthouse still burned. The causeway still connected the city to Pharos. The craftsmen of Alexandria still produced luxury goods that were prized throughout the empire. Glassware and textiles, jewelry and perfumes, books and works of art. The city's reputation for quality endured. When Romans wanted the finest things, they looked to Alexandria. And the library continued. Roman emperors took an interest in Alexandria's institutions. Augustus, who had defeated Cleopatra and made Egypt a province, reportedly established a new library, the Serapeum or Claudianum, to supplement the older collection. Perhaps it was an attempt to replace what had been lost in Caesar's fire. Perhaps it was simply the pride of a new ruler. Later emperors visited the city and marveled at its wonders. The tomb of Alexander, still preserved in its crystal coffin, drew visitors like a shrine. The lighthouse, the harbour, the great temples, all were famous throughout the Roman world. Scholars still came to Alexandria. The tradition of learning continued, passed from generation to generation. The Mouseion still provided housing and stipends for those who devoted their lives to scholarship. The library still preserved its scrolls, still copied and maintained them. But something was different. The creative energy of the Ptolemaic era had faded. The great discoveries, Euclid's geometry, Archimedes' physics, Eratosthenes' measurement of the Earth, Aristarchus' heliocentric theory, these had been made centuries earlier, in the Golden Age when the first Ptolemies ruled. The scholars who came now were more often commentators than innovators. They wrote explanations of older works, not new works of their own. They preserved and transmitted knowledge rather than pushing into new territory. This was not failure. Exactly. Commentary and preservation are valuable work. Without the scholars of the Roman period, much of what we have from antiquity would have been lost. They copied texts, annotated them, explained difficult passages, ensured that the knowledge of the past reached the future. But it was not the same as discovery. The library had become a museum rather than a laboratory, a place that honored the past rather than creating the future. And the world itself was changing. The Roman Empire, which had seemed eternal, began to show cracks. Civil wars flared. Emperors rose and fell in rapid succession. The borders were pressed by foreign peoples, Germanic tribes in the north, Persian armies in the east. In Alexandria itself, the population grew restless. Riots broke out periodically between Greeks and Jews, between factions supporting different emperors, between competing religious groups. The city that had known peace for centuries became a place of intermittent violence. More significantly, a new faith was spreading through the empire. Christianity, which had begun as a small Jewish sect in Palestine, was growing rapidly. Its followers believed in one God, rejected the old polytheistic religion, and looked forward to a world transformed. By the 4th century of the Common Era, Christianity had become the official religion of the Roman Empire. The rise of Christianity posed a challenge to the old learning. The library and the Mouseion were fundamentally pagan institutions. They had been dedicated to the Muses, those daughters of Zeus who inspired poetry and science and art. The scholars who worked there had operated within a worldview that took the Greek gods for granted. Christians viewed this heritage with suspicion. Some saw the old learning as dangerous, a temptation that might lead believers away from the true faith. Others were more moderate, arguing that pagan philosophy could be reconciled with Christian teaching. But all agreed that the old religion must be superseded. The temples of the Greek gods fell into disuse. Sacrifices ceased. The priests who had maintained the ancient rituals for centuries found themselves without a purpose. The statues of gods that had stood in public places for generations were taken down or defaced. The Muses themselves became suspect, relics of a religion that Christians were eager to replace. And in the 4th century of the Common Era, the conflicts came to a head. In 391 CE, the Roman Emperor Theodosius issued a decree banning pagan worship throughout the empire. Temples were to be closed. Sacrifices were forbidden. The old religion, which had flourished for more than 1,000 years, was to be swept away. This was not a sudden decision. Christianity had been the official religion for decades. But Theodosius went further than his predecessors. He made paganism illegal. Those who practiced the old religion could be punished by the state. In Alexandria, the response to this decree was violent. The most important pagan temple in the city was the Serapeum, the great temple of Serapis, the Greek-Egyptian god whom the first Ptolemies had created to unite their kingdom. We spoke of Serapis earlier in our story. He was a fusion of Greek and Egyptian elements, designed to be worshipped by both peoples. The Serapeum was magnificent, one of the largest religious structures in the ancient world. It stood on a hill in the southwest of the city, visible from miles away. 100 steps led up to its entrance. Within, a massive statue of Serapis sat enthroned, covered in gold and precious stones, its head nearly touching the ceiling. The temple complex included colonnades and courtyards, shrines and sacred spaces, and according to some ancient sources, it also included a library, a branch of the Great Library, housing a significant portion of the collection. We cannot be certain how many scrolls were kept in the Serapeum. Some accounts suggest it was a major repository. Others imply it was a smaller collection. The main library, in the Mouseion within the palace quarter, may have already declined by this time. Perhaps the Serapeum had become the primary home of Alexandria's scholarly heritage. Whatever the case, the Serapeum was about to be destroyed. Destruction began as a conflict between pagans and Christians. Pagans still worshipped at the Serapeum, defying the imperial decree. Christians demanded that the temple be closed and the worship stopped. Tensions escalated. There were street fights, injuries, deaths on both sides. The Patriarch of Alexandria, the Christian bishop, was a man named Theophilus. He was ambitious and aggressive, determined to establish Christianity as the sole religion of the city. He saw the Serapeum as a symbol of everything he opposed. With the support of the emperor, Theophilus led a mob against the temple. They marched up the 100 steps. They broke down the doors. They entered the sanctuary where the great statue of Serapis had sat for centuries, worshipped by countless generations, and they destroyed it. The statue was hacked to pieces. The gold was stripped away. The precious stones were looted. The wooden core was burned. The god who had watched over Alexandria for 600 years was reduced to rubble. The pagans had believed that if the statue were destroyed, the sky would fall and the world would end. It did not. The sun rose the next morning as it always had. The Christians took this as proof that their God was stronger than the old gods. The rest of the temple followed. The colonnades were pulled down. The shrines were smashed. The sacred spaces were desecrated. Everything that could be burned was burned. And the scrolls, if scrolls were indeed stored in the Serapeum, they perished in this destruction. Some accounts say nothing about books. Others describe the burning of pagan texts. We cannot be certain how much was lost. Perhaps a significant portion of what remained of the library's collection went up in flames that day. Perhaps only a relatively small branch was destroyed. Perhaps the main collection had already been moved or dispersed. The sources do not allow us to be certain. But something ended in 391 CE. Some link to the past was broken. On the ruins of the Serapeum, Theophilus built a church. Where Serapis had sat enthroned, the Christian cross now stood. The transformation was complete. 24 years later, another tragedy befell Alexandria. Her name was Hypatia. Let us speak of her, for she represents the last flowering of the old Alexandrian tradition. Hypatia was a philosopher and mathematician, the daughter of a scholar named Theon. Her father had worked in the Mouseion, editing and commenting on the ancient mathematical texts. He was one of the last scholars we can definitely connect to the library's institutions. Hypatia followed in her father's footsteps. She studied mathematics and astronomy, philosophy and rhetoric. She became a teacher herself, attracting students from across the Mediterranean who came to Alexandria specifically to study with her. She was famous for her brilliance. Ancient sources describe her as the foremost philosopher of her age, respected by pagans and Christians alike. She taught Plato and Aristotle, explained the mathematics of Euclid and Archimedes, discussed the astronomical theories of Ptolemy. She was also famous for her virtue. In an age when women were expected to marry and bear children, Hypatia remained unmarried, devoted entirely to philosophy. When a student fell in love with her, she is said to have shown him a cloth stained with her menstrual blood, saying, "This is what you really love, young man, but you do not love beauty for its own sake." The student was cured of his infatuation. Hypatia was a pagan in an increasingly Christian city. She did not attack Christianity, but she did not embrace it either. She taught the old philosophy, honored the old ways, represented a tradition that many Christians viewed with suspicion. She was also a public figure. She advised the Roman prefect of Alexandria, a man named Orestes. She had influence in political affairs. This made her dangerous to those who saw politics and religion as inseparable. The Patriarch of Alexandria by this time was a man named Cyril, the nephew of Theophilus, who had destroyed the Serapeum. Cyril was even more aggressive than his uncle, determined to extend Christian power throughout the city. Cyril and Orestes clashed repeatedly. The Patriarch wanted to control the city. The prefect represented Roman authority. Their conflict divided Alexandria into factions. Hypatia was seen as Orestes' ally. She was a pagan who advised the Roman governor. She was a woman who wielded influence in a world of men. She was a symbol of everything Cyril opposed. In 415 CE, during Lent, a group of Christian fanatics decided to act. They were led by a man named Peter, a church official. They intercepted Hypatia as she was traveling through the city in her chariot. They dragged her from her vehicle, pulled her into a church, and killed her. The murder was brutal. They used broken pottery shards, ostraca, the sharp edges of broken roof tiles, to scrape the flesh from her bones while she was still alive. When she was dead, they dismembered her body and burned the pieces in the streets. The murder of Hypatia shocked the Roman world. She had been respected by many Christians as well as pagans. She had not attacked the church or defied the emperor. She had simply taught philosophy, as scholars had done in Alexandria for 700 years. Her death was condemned even by Christian historians. It brought shame on Alexandria and on the church. Some accounts blame Cyril directly. Others say he did not order the murder but failed to prevent it. Whether Cyril was responsible or not, the effect was the same. The pagan intellectual tradition in Alexandria was finished. No philosopher would dare to teach openly after Hypatia's fate. The old learning, already declining, retreated into the shadows. The Mouseion may have continued to exist for a time, but it was no longer what it had been. Without protection, without patronage, without scholars willing to risk their lives for knowledge, it withered away. The centuries that followed were centuries of continued decline. The Roman Empire split in two, the Latin West and the Greek East. Alexandria belonged to the Eastern Empire, ruled from Constantinople. But it was no longer the center of anything. It was a provincial city, important for its grain and its harbor, but no longer a beacon of learning. The library, if it still existed in any form, was absorbed into Christian institutions. Monasteries collected manuscripts, but they were more interested in scripture and theology than in pagan philosophy. The old texts were copied, sometimes, but often they were neglected. Parchment was expensive. Why waste it on the words of pagans when it could carry the words of saints? In 641 CE, Arab armies conquered Egypt. The new rulers were Muslims, followers of the Prophet Muhammad. Within a few decades of Muhammad's death, his followers had built an empire stretching from Spain to Persia. Egypt was a key conquest, wealthy, strategic, the gateway to Africa. What did the Arab conquerors find when they entered Alexandria? They found a city much diminished from its former glory. The population had shrunk. The great buildings were crumbling. The harbour was still active, but it was no longer the centre of Mediterranean trade. And the library. By 641 CE, the library had been gone for centuries. There is a story, often repeated in later centuries, that the Caliph Omar ordered the remaining books of Alexandria to be burned. According to this legend, the Arab general Omar asked Omar what should be done with the city's books. Omar replied, "If the books agree with the Quran, they are unnecessary. If they disagree, they are dangerous. Either way, they should be destroyed." The books were used as fuel to heat the city's bathhouses for 6 months. The story is almost certainly false. It appears in sources written hundreds of years after the events. The earliest version dates from the 13th century, 600 years after the conquest. It contradicts what we know of early Islamic attitudes toward learning. The caliphs of Damascus and Baghdad were eager to preserve and translate Greek knowledge, not to destroy it. They founded libraries, patronized scholars, sponsored translation projects. Why would they have burned books in Alexandria? The story seems to be a legend, perhaps invented by later Muslim writers to explain why the famous library no longer existed. But the library had disappeared long before the Arabs arrived. If they had wanted to burn books, there would have been none to burn. What likely happened is simpler and sadder. No single disaster killed the Library of Alexandria. It died of 1,000 small wounds, fires and neglect, religious conflict and political turmoil, the simple passage of time wearing away at what generations had built. Caesar's fire took some portion of the collection. The destruction of the Serapeum took more. The murder of Hypatia marked the end of the scholarly tradition. And after that, there was no one left who cared enough to maintain what remained. Scrolls are fragile things. Papyrus crumbles. Parchment decays. Without constant care, without copying and recopying, without preservation and protection, manuscripts simply disappear. A generation of neglect can destroy centuries of accumulation. The library did not burn. It simply faded away. And so the library passed from the world. The great collection that had once numbered in the hundreds of thousands dwindled to nothing. The scrolls that had preserved the wisdom of the ancient world crumbled to dust or were scraped clean to be reused. The building that had housed them fell into ruin. By the time anyone thought to mourn the loss, there was nothing left to save. But what, exactly, did we lose? Rest now. The twilight has ended. The great library is gone, its scrolls scattered to the winds or crumbled to dust. The scholars who once walked its halls are memories, their debates silenced forever. The building itself has vanished. We are not even certain where it stood. But the story is not quite over. Something remains. In our final chapter, we shall speak of what was lost and what survives. What was lost when the Library of Alexandria disappeared? This is a question that has haunted scholars for centuries. We know that much was lost. The great majority of ancient Greek literature has not survived to the present day. But the details are frustratingly unclear, like trying to map a country by starlight. Let us walk through the ruins, as it were. Let us consider what once existed and exists no more. Begin with drama, the great tragedies that were the glory of Athens. The three great tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, wrote far more plays than we possess today. They wrote for the festivals of Dionysus, competing each year for prizes, producing trilogy after trilogy for audiences who gathered by the thousands in the great outdoor theatres. Aeschylus, the father of tragedy, wrote perhaps 90 plays over his long career. He was a veteran of Marathon, where he fought against the Persian invaders. His plays are grand and austere, filled with gods and heroes, with justice and fate. We have 7 of his plays, 7 out of 90. The Oresteia, that magnificent trilogy about the curse on the house of Atreus, about murder and vengeance and the birth of law. Prometheus Bound, about the Titan who brought fire to humanity. The Persians, written by a man who had fought against them, telling the story of their defeat. But we have lost so much more. We know the titles of many lost plays, the Soul Weighers, the Egyptians, the Phrygians, the Nurses of Dionysus. We have fragments, sometimes just a line or two, quoted by later writers who had access to copies we no longer possess. What stories did these plays tell? What insights into the human condition did they offer? We cannot know. They are gone. Sophocles, the most honored of the tragedians, wrote over 120 plays. He won more prizes at the Dionysian festivals than any other playwright. His Oedipus Rex has been called the perfect tragedy, the story of a man who seeks to escape his fate and thereby fulfills it. We have 7 of his plays, 7 out of more than 120. We have Antigone, the story of a woman who defies the state to honor the dead. We have Electra, the story of a daughter who avenges her murdered father. We have Ajax, about a hero driven mad by wounded pride. But we have lost the lovers of Achilles and the judgment of Paris. We have lost plays about Heracles and Odysseus, about Nausicaa and Phaedra. We have lost the satyr plays that followed the tragedies, bawdy, comic interludes that provided relief after the intensity of the dramas. Euripides, the youngest and most controversial of the 3, wrote about 90 plays. His works were challenging, questioning, disturbing. He gave voice to women and slaves. He showed the gods as petty and cruel. He explored the darkest corners of the human heart. We have 18 of his tragedies, plus 1 satyr play, more than we have of the other 2 combined. This is partly accident. A medieval manuscript containing 10 of his plays, alphabetically arranged from Epsilon to Kappa, happened to survive when so many others were lost. But even so, we have lost far more than we have kept. We have lost his Andromeda and his Phaethon, his Telephus and his Bellerophon. We have lost plays that ancient critics considered among his finest work. The plays we have are magnificent. Medea and the Bacchae alone would secure Euripides' immortality. But they represent less than a quarter of what he wrote. Beyond the tragedians, there were the comic playwrights. Aristophanes survives with 11 plays: the clouds, the birds, Lysistrata, the frogs. His satire is sharp, his humor bawdy, his political commentary pointed even after 2,000 years. But he wrote perhaps 40 plays. We have lost most of them, and beyond Aristophanes, there were dozens of other comic playwrights whose works have vanished entirely. Cratinus and Eupolis, Menander and Philemon, their plays were famous in antiquity, performed and quoted and loved. We have fragments, summaries, titles. The plays themselves are gone. History fared little better. We have Herodotus, who travelled the known world gathering stories of peoples and customs and wars. We have Thucydides, whose account of the Peloponnesian War remains a model of historical writing. We have Xenophon, who marched with 10,000 Greek mercenaries through the heart of Persia. But we have lost so much more. Callisthenes travelled with Alexander the Great, recording the conqueror's campaigns as they happened. His history would have been an eyewitness account of one of the most remarkable adventures in human history. We know it existed. We know it was in the library. It is gone. Theopompus wrote a history of Philip of Macedon, Alexander's father, that filled dozens of scrolls. Ephorus wrote a universal history of the Greek world covering centuries of events. Timaeus wrote the history of Sicily and the Western Mediterranean. All lost, except for fragments quoted by later writers who had access to copies we no longer possess. In philosophy, our losses are more subtle but equally painful. We have Plato and Aristotle reasonably complete. This is a blessing beyond measure. Without them, the entire history of Western thought would be different, impoverished beyond reckoning. But we have lost so much else. The early Greek philosophers, Heraclitus, who said all things flow; Parmenides, who said change is illusion; Empedocles, who explained the world through 4 elements. These thinkers survive only in fragments. We have a line here, a passage there, quoted by later writers who were summarizing or criticizing. We cannot read their original works. We cannot follow their arguments in their own words. We must reconstruct their thought from second-hand accounts, like trying to hear a symphony from someone's description of it. The Stoics and Epicureans, who shaped ancient thought for centuries, are known mainly through secondary sources. Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism, wrote extensively. His works were in the library. They are gone. Epicurus wrote 300 books. 300. The library contained many of them. Almost all are lost. We know Epicurus's philosophy through a letter or two that survived, through summaries by later writers, through a poem by the Roman Lucretius. In science, our losses delayed human progress for centuries. Hipparchus compiled a catalogue of over 800 stars, their positions, their brightnesses, their movements. This catalogue was the foundation of all ancient astronomy. It is lost. We know of it only through Ptolemy, who used it centuries later for his own astronomical system. Aristarchus proposed that the Earth goes around the Sun, a heliocentric theory that would not be accepted until Copernicus, nearly 2,000 years later. His book on the subject was in the library. It is lost, except for references by other writers. We cannot read his arguments in his own words. The physicians of Alexandria, Herophilus and Erasistratus, practiced dissection, opening human bodies to understand their structure. They described the brain and the nervous system, the heart and the blood vessels. Their works were in the library, or lost. For over 1,000 years after Alexandria's decline, human anatomy was barely understood. The knowledge that the Alexandrians had gained through careful observation was forgotten, not to be recovered until the Renaissance, when Vesalius began dissecting bodies again. We have lost poetry beyond measure. Sappho of Lesbos, whom Plato called the 10th Muse, wrote 9 books of poetry. 9 books of lyrics about love and beauty, desire and loss. The ancients considered her one of the greatest poets who ever lived. We have 1 complete poem. 1. The rest exists only in fragments. A line here, a stanza there, quoted by later writers or discovered on scraps of papyrus in Egyptian rubbish heaps. Pindar's victory odes survive, but we have lost his hymns and his paeans, his maiden songs and his dirges. We have lost the lyric poets whose names were household words in antiquity, Alcman and Alcaeus, Anacreon and Bacchylides. We have lost whole genres of poetry. Epigrams and elegies, hymns and lullabies. The songs that Greeks sang at weddings and funerals, at festivals and symposia. The verses that mothers recited to children, that lovers whispered in the dark. And we have lost, perhaps most painfully, the voices of women. We know that women in the ancient world wrote poetry and philosophy. Sappho was not alone. There were female poets whose works were collected and preserved: Corinna of Tanagra, Erinna of Telos, Gnosis of Locri. There were female philosophers in the schools of Athens and Alexandria. Their writings have almost entirely vanished. The ancient world was not kind to women's voices. Even when their works were preserved, they were often neglected, rarely copied, allowed to fade away. We cannot calculate what we lost when the library disappeared. We can only gesture the void, describe the shape of the absence. Imagine if 90% of modern literature were to vanish. Imagine if we had only a handful of novels, a few plays, fragments of poetry. Imagine if entire fields of science had to be rediscovered from scratch. That is something like what happened when the ancient world's knowledge faded away. Not everything was lost in Alexandria, of course. Much ancient literature was copied and preserved in other places. Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, had its own libraries. Monasteries throughout the Mediterranean kept manuscripts, copied and recopied them, preserved them through the dark centuries. The Islamic world played a crucial role. Arab scholars translated Greek texts into Arabic, studied them, commented on them, passed them on. Much of what we have of Aristotle came back to Europe through Arabic translations. The medical knowledge of the Greeks was preserved and developed in the hospitals of Baghdad and Damascus. The survival of what we have is a story of many hands, many copyists, many acts of preservation across centuries and cultures. A monk in Ireland, a scholar in Baghdad, a scribe in Constantinople. Each one passed the torch to the next. But the Library of Alexandria, had it survived, might have preserved so much more. It held copies of texts that existed nowhere else. It had the resources to maintain and copy manuscripts that would otherwise have crumbled to dust. It had scholars whose job was to ensure that knowledge survived. Without Alexandria, the chain of transmission was broken. Without Alexandria, much that might have been saved was lost. What would the world be like if the library had endured? We can only speculate. Perhaps we would have the lost plays of Sophocles and the complete poetry of Sappho. Perhaps we would have the scientific works that took centuries to rediscover. Perhaps we would understand the ancient world far more deeply than we do, with access to thousands of voices that are now silent. Or perhaps not. Libraries can only preserve. They cannot prevent. Even if Alexandria had survived, there would have been other disasters, other losses. The fragility of knowledge is built into its nature. What survives from the library is not scrolls, but ideas. the tradition of textual scholarship that the Alexandrians developed, comparing manuscripts, establishing authoritative texts, annotating and commenting, distinguishing what is genuine from what is spurious, that tradition lives on. Modern editors of ancient texts use methods that descend directly from the work done in Alexandria. When a scholar today compares different manuscripts of Homer, looking for the original reading, that scholar is continuing work that began in Alexandria 2,000 years ago. The ideal of universal knowledge, the ambition to gather all human learning in one place, to make it accessible and preserve it for future generations, that ideal lives on too. Every great library echoes the dream of the Ptolemies. The Library of Congress in Washington, the British Library in London, the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. Each one represents the same aspiration: to collect, to preserve, to make available. And in 2002, a new library opened on the shores of Alexandria. The Bibliotheca Alexandrina, the Library of Alexandria reborn, a modern structure of glass and granite, its roof sloped toward the sea like a great sundial. The building sits near the site where the ancient library may have stood, looking out over the same harbor. Inside, there is space for millions of books, reading rooms and conference halls, museums and galleries, specialized collections for manuscripts, for maps, for scientific instruments. It is not the ancient library. It cannot replace what was lost. The scrolls of Sappho and Sophocles will not be found there. The medical treatises of Herophilus will not reappear on its shelves. But it carries forward the tradition. It honors the vision of those long-ago kings who believed that knowledge was worth preserving. It declares that Alexandria, after all these centuries, still values learning. And perhaps that is enough. The scrolls of the ancient library are gone. The scholars who read them have been dust for millennia. The building that housed them has vanished so completely that we are not even certain where it stood. But the human impulse that created the library, the desire to understand, to preserve, to pass on what we have learned, that impulse endures. It endures because it is part of what makes us human. We are the species that remembers, that teaches, that writes things down. In every library, in every archive, in every server farm storing the digital wealth of our age, the spirit of Alexandria lives on. Every time a scholar opens an ancient text, every time a student learns a theorem that Euclid proved, every time anyone reads a word that was first written in the age of the Ptolemies, the library lives. And so our story ends. We have walked the halls of the great library, in imagination at least. We have met the scholars who made it famous, Euclid and Archimedes, Eratosthenes and Aristarchus. We have seen the kings who built it and the civilizations that inherited it. We have witnessed its long decline and mourned what was lost. There was once a place where all human knowledge lived under one roof, every poem ever written, every theorem ever proved, every map of lands both real and imagined. It stood for centuries, this treasure house of the ancient world. Ships guided by the lighthouse came to its harbor. Scholars guided by curiosity came to its doors. And for a time, it was the center of the world. And then, slowly, quietly, it slipped away. But the dream remains. The dream of understanding. The dream of preservation. The dream that knowledge, gathered and protected and passed on, might outlast the centuries. That dream is Alexandria's greatest gift to us. Not the scrolls, which are gone. Not the building, which has vanished. But the idea, the beautiful, improbable idea that humans can gather their wisdom and keep it safe. We are the heirs of Alexandria. Every library we build, every book we write, every act of teaching and learning and remembering, all of it continues what the Ptolemies began. We have lost much, but we have not lost everything. And as long as humans value knowledge, Alexandria lives. Rest now. The story is told. The lighthouse has grown dark. The scholars have laid down their pens. The scrolls rest on their shelves, waiting for readers who will never come. But somewhere a light still burns. Somewhere a book lies open. Somewhere someone is learning something new, passing the torch to the next generation, keeping the flame alive. The Library of Alexandria is gone, but knowledge endures. Sleep now, and dream, perhaps, of scrolls and scholars, of marble halls and ancient wisdom. Dream of a lighthouse burning on a dark sea, guiding ships home through the night. And know that somewhere, in libraries old and new, the work continues.